Did you know? The original Mario Party might have been planned to work with the Nintendo 64 disk drive. Booting up the North American version of the game while the disk drive is attached will lead to a blank screen, and booting up the Japanese and PAL versions of the game while the disk drive is attached will lead to an error screen. Two other games that fail to load under the same circumstances are F-Zero X and Ocarina of Time, both of which had 64DD expansions planned, with F-Zero's even seeing a release in Japan. Mario Party 2 actually started out as a 64DD project, and it's speculated that Mario Party 2 may have begun as an expansion of Mario Party for the disk drive. This idea is also supported by Mario Party 1 and 2 sharing nearly 20 of the same minigames and using the same playable characters with additional costumes. We've mentioned in previous videos how Nintendo avoided sparking controversy by altering Wario and Luigi's voice clips.
Oh my god! So I missed!
One controversy they weren't able to avoid was with the release of Mario Party 8 in the United Kingdom. On the Shy Guys Perplex Express board, Kamek uses the word spastic, which is a highly offensive slur against disabled people in the UK. The use of the word caused enough outcry for Nintendo to recall the game. Later releases replaced the offending word with erratic. There have been other regional changes in Mario Party games as well. At the end of a game on the Western Land board in Mario Party 2, the winning character engages Bowser in a quick draw duel. The Japanese version of the game has them dueling with actual revolvers, which were changed to pop guns in the international release. In the original Mario Party, several minigames had players rotating the analog stick. Rather than using their thumbs to rotate the stick, some players would use the palms of their hands as it gave them more grip and stability. Though it was effective, this method would often lead to blistered palms or other injuries. New York's Attorney General's office received close to 100 complaints of injury, which led to Nintendo of America taking action to prevent further damage. They provided gloves for anyone who had hurt their hands while playing the game and paid the state $75,000 in legal fees. Although it's unknown how much the incident cost Nintendo, providing gloves for the potential 1.2 million affected North American players could have cost the company up to $80 million. Despite the incident, Mario Party received generally positive reviews and press coverage. A few outlets panned the game, however. One of these publications was Game Informer, who gave the first Mario Party a review score of 2.5 out of 10, and the second Mario Party a 5.25 out of 10. The reviews became so infamous that Nintendo of America sent Game Informer a sarcastically written certificate stating, "Nintendo appreciated Game Informer for their well-written and glowing reviews of Mario Party and Mario Party 2." Signed by then Nintendo of America chairman Howard Lincoln and Nintendo of America founder Minoru Arakawa. The Japanese and European versions of Mario Party 1 feature a song that is completely absent from the US release. The song Move to the Mambo was used for the minigames Balloon Burst and Musical Mushrooms. Other songs from the series have had some surprising origins. The song Let's Go Lightly from the Bobsled Run minigame in Mario Party 1 is a remix of the Giant Land theme from Super Mario Bros. 3. The track Slowly Slowly is a remix of the Iceland theme, and the song Pandemonium from Mario Party 9 is a remix of the Battle Mode theme from Mario Kart Double Dash. In addition, some of the voice clips for Wario, Luigi, and Toad in Mario Party 1 were taken straight from the Japanese version of Mario Kart 64.
Did you know? There's an apparent official timeline within the main Pokemon games. In May 2014, Pokemon writer Toshinobu Matsumiya made a Twitter post showing a chronological timeline of the mainline games. The tweet showed Pokemon Red and Blue taking place at the start and at the same time as Ruby and Sapphire. These were followed by Gold and Silver, which took place at the same time as Diamond and Pearl, then followed by Black and White, with Black and White 2 taking place later and at the same time as Pokemon X and Y. The tweet was deleted shortly after, and nobody from Game Freak has commented on it since. Although Pokemon was first released in Japan in 1996, all Pokemon-related merchandise has a copyright year beginning with 1995. This is likely due to the fact Pokemon Red and Green were delayed, which isn't surprising given the game's troubled development cycle. According to a Nintendo of Japan flyer, the games were listed for release on December 21st, 1995, with the eventual release date being February 27th, 1996. In the international versions of Red and Blue, there's unused trade data where the player would trade a Butterfree in exchange for a Beedrill. This data also appears in Pokemon Yellow, but Yellow also has data for two other trades, as the ones in Cerulean and Vermilion City had been removed. They were replaced with trades of a Pidgeot for a Pidgeot and a Mew for a Mew. Both Pokemon were nicknamed Matsumiya, likely in reference to scenario writer Toshinobu Matsumiya, of which Yellow was his first credited game. These names were even translated into English. The two Pokemon were renamed Marty and Bart, respectively, perhaps as a reference to both Marty McFly and Bart Simpson. All of these trades are functional and can be accessed through hacking. Trainer rematches were a feature introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver. However, in an interview with Pokemon CEO Tsunekazu Ishihara, he revealed that during Red and Green's testing and debugging process, the game would trigger a trainer battle every time you walked past them. This would happen even if the player already fought the trainer before, thus allowing rematches. This also made areas like Viridian Forest take upwards to an hour to get through. The encounter rate for wild Pokemon was again much higher, with the player being unable to take 2 steps without bumping into a Pokemon. Ishihara said it would have taken players literally half a day to get through a cave, so the team changed things accordingly for the final game. Another element that was introduced in Gold and Silver were shiny Pokemon. One interesting tidbit about shiny Pokemon is that during the introduction of Pokemon Black and Pokemon White, there's a 1 in 8,192 chance that the Minichino shown by Professor Juniper will be a shiny. There's several other instances of shiny Pokemon appearing in catching tutorials and other unobtainable sections, going back as far as Ruby and Sapphire. In the catching tutorial for Ruby and Sapphire, it's possible for the rival Wally to capture a shiny Ralts, only for it to not be shiny in all future appearances. More early and unused elements of Red and Green were unveiled in a manga chronicling Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri, released in May of 2018. This included ideas previously unknown to the general public, from unused Pokemon to early sprite work. Among the sprites, an early version of Nidoking is shown with a full-body back sprite, as opposed to the top half shown in the final game. Full-body back sprites wouldn't be given to all Pokemon until Pokemon Black and White, over 14 years later. Pokemon artist Ken Sugimori said back sprites were made so that battles would appear to take place from the perspective of the trainer character, and since each Pokemon needed one, they used this to show obscure details on a Pokemon, such as how Clefairy's wings look like a bow or Pikachu's stripes. Pokemon like Grimer and Muck were also given a wave-like pattern on their body to simulate movement on the Game Boy, where the Pokemon sprites remained static. In a 2014 portfolio of Sugimori's career, the art he did was originally made for the game's upcoming guidebooks, as before then the only art they had to go on was the original sprites. Using the pixel art ripped from the game, Sugimori had to draw each Pokemon and human character based on what he was given. During this process, he would remove design elements in a Pokemon that he didn't like. This may explain changes like with Pikachu, who originally had a white underbelly in its earliest depictions. As many Pokemon are designed by different people on the team, his job is to unify the design so that the different styles don't clash with each other in a distracting way. For example, Pokemon like Dratini and Dragonair were designed by Atsuko Nishida, with Dragonite being done by Shigeki Morimoto. Pokemon designed by Sugimori himself include the Bulbasaur line, Mewtwo, and Clefairy. Sugimori has mentioned that one of his favorite Pokemon is Venusaur. However, given its complex design, it's also his least favorite Pokemon to draw. Conversely, Gengar is one of his favorites due to how simple it is to draw, and is another Pokemon he designed himself. In April of 1997, Sugimori had done cover art for a Japanese magazine, and many fans theorized the designs shown were prototypes made for upcoming Pokemon games like Gold and Silver, which were initially planned for a '97 release. The second generation of Pokemon games were teased as early as January 1997, and this artwork also came out the same time as the Pokemon anime, where the Pokemon Ho-Oh made a cameo in the first episode, adding to the speculation. Sugimori has cleared this up, saying these designs actually weren't made for Pokemon at all. They were drawn more as a fun what-if picture for Game Review magazine, with characters in their own world separate from Pokemon. Despite this, one of the creatures shown has a striking resemblance to the Generation 2 Pokemon Tyranitar, indicating they liked this what-if design enough to actually use it. Sugimori has also said that one of the biggest factors that goes into a Pokemon's design is what the Pokemon in question would eat. Whether it's based on an animal or an inanimate object, or even if it doesn't have a mouth, it's something that needs to be addressed for the Pokemon to be believable. Sugimori said, Ghost-type Pokemon, for example, example, might feed on the spirit or reap energy from the air around them. If we were going to make a Pokemon based on the motif of a car, what would it eat? Would you make it able to suck up gasoline? How would it use the energy it got from that? How would it use that source of power? Even if the design is based on a car, a Pokemon is a living creature, so we would work over and over how to express its carness and what its source energy should be. When coming up with a Pokemon, Game Freak refers to the Pokemon by their code names, typically not remembering the final names given to them, but always by the placeholders. Starting out, Game Freak was a small group and wasn't worried about having code names for each Pokemon, with director Junichi Masuda being unsure if Pikachu even had one. As things got more professional, code names were said to be a bit more creative than they've been recently, with Pokemon like Crabrawler being referred to as Crab 1 during development of Sun and Moon. On the design side of things, Masuda has said that the team doesn't worry about running out of ideas for Pokemon designs, even more so as the series progresses. They try to find a balance of Pokemon based on real animals as well as ones based on inanimate objects. On top of directing, Masuda is also responsible for many of the series' music tracks, and had a certain method for composing when first starting out. In the original Pokemon games, Pokemon were seen more as monsters that people found scary, so for places like caves and forests, the music would be eerie and unnerving. For Viridian Forest, Masuda would have the track loop in different places to give off a creepier vibe, saying that the piece was all done by feeling, arranging it as he went along, and having no base inspiration for the song. Masuda has said for music relating to battles, it's important the team makes the distinction between a trainer battle theme and a wild Pokemon theme. Players may end up catching and befriending the wild Pokemon, so the music should reflect that, and not sound too intimidating. Masuda says finding the right balance in their music is very important, and is one of several elements that makes Pokemon unique among other RPGs.
Did you know? Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts wasn't the first version of the game Rare attempted to develop. It actually ended up being their third attempt over several years of brainstorming. A third Banjo-Kazooie game was teased as early as the year 2000, when series antagonist Gruntilda threatened Banjo and friends at the end of Banjo-Tooie, saying, "Just you wait until Banjo 3. Although the core Banjo team's next project after Banjo-Tooie was grabbed by the Ghoulies, there is some evidence that a third game was at least considered for the GameCube. The biggest clue being a tech demo shown off by Rare at Space World 2000, featuring the Banjo-Kazooie cast in a new engine. Though this was during a time where the gaming industry was going through some big changes. What could once be done with a small team on the Nintendo 64 would now take a larger team and budget for the new console generation. Rare's co-founders, Tim and Chris Stamper, had expected Nintendo to buy Rare outright, making them a first-party development studio and combating the rising costs. To their surprise, that never happened, and they were instead bought by Microsoft in 2002. All of Rare's intellectual properties were also bought with the company, including Banjo-Kazooie, and any GameCube projects were either cancelled or made their way to the Xbox. The game that eventually became Nuts and Bolts, while referencing the events of the previous games, was never intended to be a straight sequel. When the team started work on a new Banjo-Kazooie game for the Xbox hardware, codenamed Banjo X, they initially planned to do a complete remake of the original game. This game would have shared a basic structure with its predecessor, but also introduced new challenges and changed old ones in ways that would surprise even series veterans. As the game started to take form, however, the team became concerned that players would see it as a mere graphical update to the original and that it might be hard to sell as a result. The team got as far as revamping Mumbo's Mountain before taking the game in a new direction, and little else was known about this build until August of 2015. Former Rare designer Steve Mail shared models of Mumbo's Mountain characters Conga and Ticker, which, among other things, showed that the game adopted an angular style well before Nuts and Bolts. A more conventional model of Mumbo himself was made a year prior to test out lip syncing with the character. The second concept Rare put into development was also planned to be a traditional platformer, but would feature a more direct rivalry between the protagonists and Gruntilda. The plan was to allow Grunty to interfere with the player's progress by having her complete the same tasks as the player, from collecting items to solving puzzles. Rare foresaw that the level of complexity needed for Grunty's AI would cause issues down the road, so they scrapped the idea and changed direction yet again. For their third attempt, the team decided to create a game similar to previous entries while still doing something new with the 3D platforming genre. In an interview, designer Greg Mayles said, "The next idea was looking at how players travel in platform games. How can we make the traveling to the objective as fun as the objective itself? The team always wanted to make a game where the player was able to construct things, and it was Tim Stamper who had the idea of allowing the player to use blocks to build their own vehicles, an idea that eventually became the focus of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. The game would originally include levels from the previous games with new features built in to work with the driving mechanic. The first prototype was set in Mumbo's Mountain, though the final product ended up having all new locations. When it came to Banjo and Kazooie's character designs, the team experimented with several art styles and tried to update the duo without losing what made them so special. The team did try using high-resolution versions of the N64 models, but they felt the original charm just wasn't there. Artist Ed Bryan suggested a design that embraced both smooth surfaces and hard edges, feeling it retained the duo's history while being a perfect fit for the game's theme of construction. Nuts and Bolts wasn't the first game in the series that had a difficult development process. The story of the first Banjo-Kazooie game's development is just as interesting, starting life as an isometric adventure game for the Super Nintendo, codenamed Project Dream. Inspired by the likes of the Zelda series and LucasArts point-and-click games, Dream was going to be Rare's magnum opus on the system, with ACM graphics going beyond that of Donkey Kong Country. Taking place in a fantastical world, the game stars a boy named Edison and his dog Dinger. The two embark on an adventure and get tangled up with a group of pirates led by the infamous Captain Black-Eye, who had a dog of his own named Ripper. This build of the game was only worked on for a few months before development shifted to the recently released N64, and the game changed drastically after the move to new hardware. It received a more mature tone to reach a wider audience, with the pirate motif gradually replacing the fairy tale themes, and it wasn't long before Edison himself fell out of favor with the team as well. As designer Greg Mayles put it, Edison over this time kind of started to lose his relevance. The world was changing around him and we still had this young guy with a wooden sword. We started exploring alternatives to a boy. Originally starting off with a rabbit, to which Greg thought was a bad idea, they soon settled on the design of a humanoid bear with a backpack to store his equipment. This character would go through a few iterations before becoming the Banjo we know today. Development on Dream continued for another 16 months, in which time Rare realized that the title was becoming too ambitious for the small team to handle. The game was mostly scrapped, save for Banjo, as the team grew fond of him. It was then decided to reimagine the game completely, centering it around the new protagonist. The game took on the form of a 2.5D platformer, following the formula of Rare's Donkey Kong Country games, and the game's title changed from Dream to Kazoo. A snapshot of this build even showed up in the final product, previously thought to have been from a scrapped level called Fungus Forest. When experimenting with Banjo's character design, the team thought of giving him a skateboarder look, and even made some of his animations reflect the aesthetic, but these didn't stick for long. This build would have also used balls as power-ups and had a fruit-based system which featured 5 different fruit houses, integral to solving jigsaw puzzles. Kazooie didn't exist at this point, but her creation stemmed from the idea of giving Banjo a double jump. The team wanted a double jump that could believably be done anywhere, giving players more flexibility. They had the idea of wings sprouting out of Banjo's backpack, which soon led to a set of legs for traversing areas, and eventually a full character who lived in the backpack itself. The game then became known as Banjo-Kazooie, but Kazoo gave the team trademark issues, so adding an IE to the name, it became Banjo-Kazooie. It was at this point that the team got a true sense of direction for their game. After being inspired by an early build of Super Mario 64, Rare changed direction one last time and redesigned Banjo-Kazooie to be more in line with what Mario was doing. And within 1 week of scrapping the old game, an entire level of the new game went from concept to completion. That level being Mumbo's Mountain, the first stage in the final release of Banjo-Kazooie, and in another 16 months, the game was done. As the Banjo-Kazooie series evolved, each game left its share of mechanics on the cutting room floor, the most well-known of these being the fabled stop-and-swap feature. Rare discovered by accident that if you took a cartridge out of the N64 while the power was on, remnants of the game's data would still be in the console's RAM for a short time. Rare wanted to reward players with unlockable items by swapping the cartridges between certain games, hinted at with Donkey Kong 64. Performing a specific glitch triggers an unused cutscene, panning to a corner in DK's treehouse and transporting the player to Crystal Caves. An early screenshot of the game showed that same corner once had a Banjo-Kazooie themed shower stall. There's also text in DK64's data referring to the Ice Key, an item linked to Banjo-Kazooie's Stop and Swap. Because of these connections, it's thought that the key would have been used to access a secret area from DK's treehouse. Rare didn't tell Nintendo about this feature until Banjo-Kazooie was nearly finished, thinking Nintendo wouldn't need to know. To which Nintendo told them the idea wasn't guaranteed to work in all cases for the N64 due to variations in newly manufactured consoles. This, coupled with concern of players damaging their cartridges, led to the feature being dropped, which is why remnants of it are still in the games, albeit useless. Stop and swap wasn't the only major feature to be cut in a Banjo game. The final world from Banjo-Tooie was greatly cut down from its initial design. Cauldron Keep would have been a more fleshed out castle level, featuring a graveyard and treasure chamber. It would have also had 10 jiggies to find, but the team ran out of time and had to scale the level back. This is why Banjo-Tooie has only 90 jiggies total compared to Banjo-Kazooie's 100. Banjo-Kazooie was also planned to have full voice acting, but the team realized recording speech would greatly increase development time. To counter this, they initially had an idea called Bubble Speak, where dialogue was conveyed via thought bubble, being a funnier alternative to text and more unilingual. Eventually, they spliced up sound clips to make the noises, most being done by the game's composer, Grant Kirkhope. Dream was heavily themed around its music, and as a carryover, Banjo had a musical motif as well. Characters were even going to sing to introduce themselves in the game's opening, but that idea was dropped. This intro was also originally done in motion capture, but it was decided animating it by hand would make a better product. The little shimmy Banjo did was kept in though, as the team liked it. While the main characters were named after musical instruments, several other names came from members of the team simply messing around with each other. The name of Banjo-Tooie's boss Wu Fak Fak is a reference to a rare programmer who, according to colleagues, would swear when he was having programming issues, and when overcoming a problem would exclaim, "Woo!" Banjo's goldfish Royston got his name from one of the game's artists who had that as a middle name, so they put it in the game out of pity, and at his expense. Royston's also made surprise appearances in other rare games such as Ghoulies and Viva Pinata. Even Banjo-Kazooie's spiritual successor, Yooka-Laylee, has a nod to the fish in the character Dr. Puzz, both of which were designed by Ed Bryan.
The Game Boy had an incredibly long life for a piece of gaming hardware, with it being released in 1989 and not being discontinued until the year 2003. This long life brought tons of memorable and beloved games with it, and despite the system's audio and graphical limitations, it was the first time gamers could genuinely take good and engaging titles on the go. The system was the birth of the Pokemon franchise, which went on to become, well, the Pokemon franchise, that you definitely know about already, but other smash hit titles like Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins also pushed Nintendo into the status of a home entertainment staple. And of course we'll be talking about Super Mario Land 2 as well as Pokemon Gold and Silver in today's episode. But first we want to talk about a surprisingly interesting Game Boy game with a truly unique feature, Mission Impossible. Film tie-ins used to be far more prevalent in the gaming space at the time of the Game Boy, with most of which honestly being a total waste of time. Companies knew that they could make a quick buck selling games to people that had just seen the latest blockbuster, so relatively mundane video games were a great means of extra revenue for small to mid-sized game studios and film studios alike. With Mission Impossible, which was released for the Game Boy Color, a rather unique feature was included in the game which made use of a new addition to the Game Boy Color's hardware, the IR sensor. The game includes the Impossible Mission Force Agent Organizer, essentially a rudimentary PDA at a time when such devices would have cost an arm and a leg. Players could store notes, addresses or messages and then transmit that data from one player to another who also had a copy of the game. However, the infrared sensor was used for something a little more impressive than even wireless communication circa 2000, the ability to use your games console as a remote control for your TV. The game was able to learn signals used by remote controls for things like radios or televisions, allowing you to change the channel without access to the remote control, essentially serving as a universal remote. This can be handy while at home, though booting up Mission Impossible on your Game Boy Color may be a bit long-winded to switch channels from Law & Order to Countdown. But it would also mean that you could change channels on a TV out in public, if you've configured your system correctly, even working from up to 20 feet away. This essentially grants the player the ability to be their own small-time Tom Cruise, or even smaller-time Tom Cruise. From a major blockbuster film series to a blockbuster game franchise, Final Fantasy Legend is well known for not always being a Final Fantasy game. It's pretty well known these days that the title's branding was changed in the West to focus entirely on Final Fantasy, when the game's Japanese name being Seiken Densetsu, with Final Fantasy Gaiden being its subtitle. But this isn't the only time the game was changed, and this is far from the biggest change that occurred. According to a Japanese Seiken Densetsu guidebook, one of the title's programmers claimed that the game actually began its life as an experimental tennis game. The quote, as translated by Clyde Mandelin, reads, "This game actually started out as an experimental tennis game. At some point, the court turned into scrollable screens, the racket turned into the playable character, the ball into a weapon, the opponent's racket turned into enemies, and the court became what was referred to as the map. And before I realized it, a story was added into it, and then the game was released as Seiken Densetsu. It was a curious experience." It isn't going to be a Nintendo system without some kind of breakout hit Mario title making an appearance. And while the first Super Mario Land was by no means a bad experience, Nintendo made great leaps with their sequel, Super Mario Land 2: 6 Golden Coins. The first Mario Land was perhaps limited in its appearance, with Mario being just 10 pixels tall, but for 6 Golden Coins, we got a more detailed look at the plumber and the world he's in. But this more detailed look put a spotlight on how strange the game's art direction and design really was, with things like a Jason Voorhees-inspired enemy and a world made of knockoff Lego. But apparently, the game was originally far more unusual. During an interview with the game's director and designer, Hiroji Kiyotake, he stated, "With Super Mario Land 2, one of our ideas was not to be bound by the conventions of the previous games. However, when we showed our first draft to everyone, they were like, I don't know, is this Mario? We realized that we were on the wrong path. So we toned down that idea and made something a little closer to the existing Mario world." But it seems that the developers may have overcorrected, and later in development tried once again distancing Mario Land 2 from other Mario games. The title originally used the same sound effect for Mario turning into Super Mario as Super Mario World. But halfway into development, the team decided that hearing the Super Mario World sound effect on the Game Boy was just a bit off. And they were afraid that players would become negatively conscious of the fact that they were playing on a small screen and begin to compare Mario Land 2 with the audibly and graphically far superior Mario World. 6 Golden Coins was also the birthplace of one of Mario's most iconic characters, Wario. Wario didn't just work as a fantastic villain for the series, but could even transition the gap of antagonist to protagonist. Wario Land 2 for the Game Boy was an extremely well-received title, and most likely served as the cement for Wario's position in the Mario franchise. The title received a re-release just a few months after its initial release on the OG Game Boy, which optimized it for the Game Boy Color hardware. In the Game Boy Color enhanced release of the game, while still possible to play on a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color, the save files for both systems were not compatible with each other. For this reason, when trying to play a Game Boy Color save file on the Game Boy, or vice versa, the game will go through a set of menus to delete old save data to accommodate that of the other system. So forget about lending it to a friend and expecting your save data back. Another change between both versions appears in the levels Turn Off the Giant Faucet and Escape from the Teacup. These levels contain a unique fish enemy that grabs Wario and pins him to a wall until he escapes. For unknown reasons, the Game Boy Color release replaces this unique fish enemy with a standard sawfish. Despite this omission, full color graphics for the unique fish are still present in the game's code, so at some point it was clearly planned to remain in the game. Another Nintendo series with a strong following is the curled ball of strawberry milkshake Kirby. Kirby's Dream Land 2 actually contains a fairly large number of secrets and cameo appearances from other familiar faces, such as the mini-boss Blocky, who originally appeared as one of the enemies in HAL Lab's earlier series, Adventures of Lolo. Not only this, but if the player frees the same animal friend as they're already riding, then there is a fairly infrequent occurrence that the sacks which usually contain Gooey will instead contain Blob, a female version of Gooey. This isn't the case in the game's original Japanese release though, where Blob's role is actually taken by Chao, the female protagonist from Famicom Fairy Tales Yuyuki, a Japanese-only Famicom Disk System adventure game by Nintendo. It's also possible to unlock a sound test mode in the game, which displays an image of Kirby, Rick, Kine and Koo all sitting around a table, whilst Gooey and Blob play a piano in the background. Once again, however, this differs from the Japanese release of the game, where Chao can be seen sitting at the piano, recreating a scene from Famicom Fairy Tales Yuyuki. Another of the Pink Puffball's games to hit the Game Boy was Kirby Star Stacker, and this too had a number of elements changed when localized outside of Japan. One of the most notable is the game's various food items being swapped from fairly common dishes in Japanese cuisine to something more commonly found throughout the West. One other thing missing from Western territories was a complete remake of the game, released as Kirby's Super Star Stacker in 1998, exclusively in Japan for the Super Famicom. At one stage, the game was set to be localized internationally, but because the Super Nintendo was coming to the end of its lifespan in North America and Europe, the decision was made to keep it exclusive to Japan. Now, Radar Mission is likely one Nintendo-developed game that you didn't keep up with. Released in 1990, the title is a fairly simple take on the classic tabletop game Battleships, and since the general theme of the game is war, it seems Nintendo wanted to sneak in their own little Easter egg to reference another of their popular licenses. In the game, the player uses a star symbol, while the enemy forces use a moon symbol, the same symbols used by the ally and enemy forces in Famicom Wars, as well as the other Wars titles, such as Advance Wars.
Did you know it's estimated that Doom was the most installed piece of software in 1995? The game was installed on more computers than even Microsoft's Windows 95. The popularity of the game prompted Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates to consider buying id Software, but instead Microsoft opted to develop a Windows 95 port of Doom to promote the operating system as a gaming platform. On October 30th, 1995, Microsoft presented a promotional video for Windows 95 featuring Bill Gates superimposed into the game. Development of Doom began after id Software released Wolfenstein 3D. Lead programmer and innovator of the first-person shooter genre John Carmack began to work on this next project in total isolation, as the rest of the team at id worked on the sequel to Wolfenstein. For this new game engine, Carmack developed code to display texture-mapped ceilings and floors, varying light levels, and even sloped flooring, although this feature was later removed. Initially, the team wanted to make a licensed game based on the film Aliens. id Software had even begun negotiating with 20th Century Fox for the license. However, this plan was abandoned to allow the developers more creative freedom. The final concept for Doom took some influence from Aliens, but it was also influenced by other Hollywood movies. The chainsaw and super shotgun weapons were directly inspired by the Evil Dead series. The name Doom came from a line in the movie The Color of Money, where Tom Cruise shows up at a pool hall with a custom pool cue in a case. When asked what's inside the case, he replies, Doom. The idea to use demons as enemies came up after some of the developers from id played a campaign of Dungeons & Dragons that ended with demons bursting through a portal and overrunning the game. Creative director Tom Hall had originally drafted an elaborate storyline for Doom in a design document called the Doom Bible. The game was to take place in a military research base on an alien planet called Tanga, where creatures from hell would suddenly burst in and attack. There were going to be 5 playable characters, each with their own unique abilities. The storyline originally involved traveling to Hell and back, and eventually Tanga would be destroyed. The protagonist would then be held responsible and sent to jail. John Carmack did not approve of the detailed storyline, and so the Doom Bible was mostly ignored in the final version. Carmack explained his position on video game narratives in 2003, stating, "Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important." Even though the story was discarded, some of the original concepts from the Doom Bible were implemented in the final game. These include the location of military bases on extraterrestrial planets, the concept of traveling to and from Hell, and modified versions of some weapons as well as some monsters that were originally conceived in the Doom Bible. Additionally, Tom Hall took some of his Doom Bible concepts with him after leaving id Software to work at 3D Realms. The first-person shooter Rise of the Triad starred a group of main characters designed after the characters planned to appear in the Doom Bible game. And the PC flight combat game Terminal Velocity featured a planet called Tanga. The Cacodemon monsters are inspired by the classic Dungeons & Dragons monster, the Beholder. The design of the Cacodemon, however, comes from another Dungeons & Dragons monster, the Astral Dreadnought. The Doom series has a lot more hidden secrets and Easter eggs. In early versions of the map Command Control, players can find a room containing a Nazi swastika symbol on the ceiling and floor. This was intended as a reference to Wolfenstein 3D, but it was later removed because of controversy. Wolfenstein was referenced again in Doom 2 as a secret secret map that can be accessed in level 15. This secret map was based on floors 1 and 9 from Escape from Castle Wolfenstein and even includes Nazi soldiers from Wolfenstein as enemies. Another secret map in Doom 2 contains these same Nazi soldiers as enemies, but it also includes a reference to id Software's Commander Keen series. The names of the levels in various Doom iterations have interesting origins. The first episode of the original Doom, Knee Deep in the Dead, was one of the few titles from the Doom Bible that survived the overhaul. The fourth and final episode of Ultimate Doom, called Thy Flesh Consumed, gets its name from a passage in the King James translation of the Bible. Proverbs 5:11 reads, "And thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed." In fact, most levels in Thy Flesh Consumed also get their names from Bible passages. The 21st level in Doom 2 is called Nirvana, and a shotgun can be found in the first sector of this level. This is possibly a reference to the band Nirvana, whose lead singer Kurt Cobain died from a self-inflicted shotgun blast the same year Doom 2 was released. This wouldn't be the only example of a reference to a popular rock band in the Doom series. The first level of Thy Flesh Consumed, Hell Beneath, contains a hidden room with a logo for the band 9 Inch Nails. The soundtrack for Doom 2 contains a wide range of musical inspirations from other popular rock and heavy metal artists. A track titled Bye Bye American Pie contains a sample of the song Them Bones by Alice in Chains. The track Sean's Got the Shotgun features a drum beat lifted from the song South of Heaven by Slayer. The track Into Sandy's City uses a slower take of the opening melody from the song Sex Type Thing by Stone Temple Pilots. And the track The Demon's Dead uses the opening melody of After All the Dead by Black Sabbath.
Did you know? The original design of Bomberman was very different to what we see in the games. The first two titles in the franchise, Bomberman and 3D Bomberman, feature a human character donning suspenders and a bowler hat. While these games didn't originally release in Western countries, a censored version of Bomberman was published as Eric and the Floaters in Europe. However, for the 1985 Famicom release, Bomberman's design was changed to that of a robot. This may have been done to save money, as the sprite for the White Bomber was a reused asset from 1984's Lode Runner. This is probably because the Famicom port of Bomberman was created in a mere 72 hours. Game developer Shinichi Nakamoto took the concept of the original game and updated it for Nintendo's console in a single marathon development session. Nakamoto was known for chewing a lot of gum. He eventually ran out in these 72 hours and resorted to chewing on pencils until the end of development. Bomberman went on to sell nearly 1 million copies on the NES, which was an unprecedented success for Hudson. Because of the reused Lode Runner assets, the ending of Bomberman may suggest it's a prequel to Lode Runner. In the NES original manual, it stated that one day Bomberman heard a rumor that if a robot were to escape the underground compound and make it to the surface, they would become human. This is supported by the North American and Japanese versions of the game. Once completed, the English game states the player succeeded in helping Bomberman become a human, and that they might recognize him in a future game. The Japanese version is a little less subtle, with the ending text being, "Congratulations, Bomberman becomes Runner. See you again in Lode Runner." The concept of these two titles being connected was dropped after the initial games, as developer Hudson Soft wanted to separate the universes. But in 2006, this concept was revisited in Bomberman Act Zero for the Xbox 360. Act Zero contains a more modern approach to the franchise, but has many parallels to the original one. Both took place in an underground factory where the titular character was fighting to get to the surface. The Nintendo 64's Bomberman Hero was initially going to be a new entry in the Bonk franchise. The Bonk series is known as the Genjin series in Japan, and according to Bonk developers Shoichi Yoshikawa's official website, a game called Ultra Genjin was in development for the Nintendo 64. After production was halted on Ultra Genjin, it was reworked into Bomberman Hero. This may explain why Bomberman Hero was one of the only games in the franchise which allowed the player to jump. Bomberman Hero's story may have also been based on Star Wars A New Hope. The antagonists, the Garadan Empire, are based on a giant spherical space station similar to the Death Star. The lead female character, Princess Million, is captured by the Empire while carrying important data, but smuggles it out via a robot. This robot then encounters Bomberman in the middle of a desert while seeking assistance. Later in the game, Princess Million is found laying in the exact same pose as Princess Leia when she was in the Empire cells. And, likely as a reference to Empire Strikes Back, the robot is held captive and turned to stone. As well as having references in his own games, Bomberman has made cameo appearances in other franchises. Bomberman appears in the Japanese exclusive Dream Mix TV World Fighters as a playable character. He appears alongside Metal Gear's Solid Snake, Castlevania's Simon Belmont, and even Optimus Prime in a 4-player fighter similar to the Super Smash Bros. Games. Despite being a fairly tame and family-friendly franchise, the Bomberman series has plenty of cut and censored content. The American-made Atomic Bomberman was unusually produced, as it was the first game in the series not to be made in Japan. It used extensive voice samples by popular voice actors Charlie Adler and Billy West, but there are many recordings that went unused. Some of these include voice clips of the bombers swearing. This includes lines such as,
Yeah, don't make me come out there and stomp both your asses.
That's right there, tits.
and
I am so proud of you I could just shit.
in World 1 of Bomberman Generations for the GameCube, there's a species of native octopus enemies. These creatures are purple, have big pink lips, and use basic weapons such as spears. Within the game's data, there's an unused texture for the enemy depicting them with brown skin. It's likely that these creatures were originally brown but were changed to purple to avoid comparisons to racial stereotypes of black people. Super Bomberman 5 on the Super Nintendo also has cut content. The game had a 10th playable character named Subordinate Bomber that was cut for unknown reasons. However, they can still be used by hacking the game, and they're even fully animated. The fate of the Bomberman franchise seems to be up in the air, and the frequency of game releases has diminished since Hudson was acquired by Konami in 2011. In a 2007 interview with Gamasutra, a straining relationship could already be seen between Hudson Japan and Konami US. This was alluded to by then Hudson president John Grainer and marketing director John Lee. The two were asked how they felt about Bomberman Act Zero's largely negative reception and poor sales. Grainer believed that poor communication between Hudson and Konami US was the cause, and that Konami should have focused their marketing on the game's multiplayer. Grainer elaborated, stating, "When you look at the way the Japanese intended the game to be marketed and how it was marketed, there is a disconnect. And I think it's an unfortunate thing that happened because Japanese Hudson and Konami US don't speak to each other. So that needed to be properly explained because the game is made as a multiplayer battle game, which is what the Japanese Hudson people thought American people really wanted." Lee echoed Grainer's view, stating there was a logic to how they built it, but that was never conveyed properly. The poor relationship between Hudson and Konami can be seen elsewhere. A 3DS game called Bomberman 3DS was planned for release and even shown off in 2011. It would have had the series' flagship multiplayer mode as well as a single-player campaign. This title was canceled without an official reason, and since several other Hudson games were canceled around the same time, it's believed that Bomberman 3DS was canceled by Konami after they bought out Hudson. Another, much older canceled game is Virtual Bomberman for the Virtual Boy. After being shown off at Famicom Space World 95, it was delayed and ultimately canceled due to the failure of the Virtual Boy. However, elements of the game carried over to the PlayStation exclusive Bomberman World. This includes a few of the animal partners and mechs from promotional artwork. The most notable reused element comes from the mysterious character God Bomber. While different in overall appearance, the God Bomber in Virtual Bomberman and Bomberman World share the same name and even the same emblem on their helmets.
Did you know? Similar to how Cranky Kong was an aged-up take on the original Donkey Kong, Diddy began as a redesign of Donkey Kong Jr. In 2015, Rare designer Greg Mail shared pictures from a book titled Donkey Kong and the Golden Bananas over Twitter, showing some early concepts for Donkey Kong Country. One page shows Diddy while he was still proposed as an update to Jr., but Nintendo felt this redesign was too different to what came before. They asked Rare to either keep Jr.'s old look or to make this new design an entirely new character. Rare felt the design fit their update to Donkey Kong's world and made him a new Kong. After a few naming attempts, they settled on the name Diddy, a slang term for small in some parts of the UK. Diddy's final design was done by Rare artist Kevin Bayliss, who we reached out to for further details. Bayliss wanted a friendlier looking design in contrast to Donkey Kong's more ill-tempered look. He also gave Diddy a tail so he could grab onto objects or even use it as a spring. Diddy's shirt and hat were added to make him stand out from the greens and browns of the backgrounds and were colored red to match up with DK's tie. The clothing idea also came from a series of UK commercials for tea-brand PG Tips, where chimpanzees were dressed in various clothes. The chimps were provided by Twycross Zoo, located very close to Rare, and is also where the team gained inspiration for other DK characters. Diddy was made to serve as a second hit for the player, one that wouldn't get in the way. For Country, the team wanted the game's screen to be as clutter-free as possible. Taking inspiration from Mario's changing in size, Mails said Diddy represented a visual health bar, as well as making the player not feel alone on their journey. As the series progressed, Player 2 became more integral to the gameplay than just soaking up a hit. During development of Donkey Kong Country 2, many names were brainstormed for its potential title. Possible names ranged from Diddy Kong Country and Kremling's The New Batch, to Diddy Kong in Space, even though he's not, and Diddy's Quest for a decent name for his game. The final title became Diddy's Conquest, a pun on the term conquest that also referenced Diddy stepping into the limelight. Many fans mistakenly refer to it as Diddy Kong's Quest, though early footage of the game shows it did take on that title for a short time. Diddy's character design was still receiving some tweaks even at this point. Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto and some of his staff sent sketches of logo ideas for Diddy and Dixie's hats, though Rare used none of them. Instead, they inscribed the Nintendo logo on Diddy's hat and gave a Rare pin to Dixie. Though Dixie's pin disappeared after Rare was sold to Microsoft, the Nintendo branding has stuck with Diddy to this day. This game also marked the debut of the yellow star pattern on Diddy's shirt, though these changes wouldn't be seen in-game until the Nintendo 64 era. Speaking of the N64, Diddy Kong Racing wasn't a Diddy-centered game until very late in development. In the months leading to its release, the game was known as Pro-Am 64, an indirect update to the RC Pro-Am series that featured Timber the Tiger in the lead role. Banjo-Kazooie was planned to be Rare's big holiday title for 1997, but was delayed to the following summer to reach its full potential. This left Rare in a bit of a bind. Suddenly Pro-Am was their Christmas game, and they weren't sure if the brand was strong enough to grab people's attention. The team decided to rebrand the game using Diddy Kong, though Nintendo gave them the choice to pick either Diddy or Donkey Kong for the lead role. In an interview with Nintendo Life, artist Lee Musgrave said, "Nintendo enjoyed the fact that we chose Diddy Kong over Donkey Kong. I think that it was us trying to build on the fact that Diddy was ours and DK was theirs. The team then changed a few things around to attach it to the new IP better, with Musgrave admitting it was a bit of a rush job." Having little competition in its release window, Diddy Kong Racing was the center of attention for Nintendo's marketing. It sold nearly 5 million copies and stands as one of the top 10 best-selling games for the N64. There were several attempts to create a follow-up to Diddy Kong Racing, with each one failing to release as intended, if at all. Following Rare's sale to Microsoft, Diddy Kong Pilot was retooled to Banjo Pilot, and Donkey Kong Racing was cancelled outright. Later, around April 2004, Studio Climax created a GameCube pitch called Diddy Kong Racing Adventure, a project that wasn't publicly known until November 2016, when gaming archivist Andrew Borman obtained the prototype and published a video on it. Like the original, it would have featured an adventure mode complete with boss battles and multiple vehicle choices. A roster of 14 was planned, and Climax hoped to use the existing cast plus characters from Banjo-Kazooie and Conker. In the event a character was unavailable, a Kong family member would take their place. Each character would have also had their own special moves, such as Timber unleashing a Sonic Wave roar attack and Tip-Top using a ring of turtle shells. Other proposed features included weather plus day and night settings, several multiplayer modes, and the ability to change vehicles mid-race, an idea similar to Donkey Kong Racing's animal mechanic. The prototype was shown to Nintendo, but they passed on it. One likely reason is that the rights to Diddy Kong Racing are split between Nintendo and Rare, and it may have been seen as too much of a legal hassle.
Did you know? Despite its simple premise of Pokemon battling in 3D, the Pokemon Stadium series had a fairly complex development. For starters, the game most Westerners know as Pokemon Stadium is actually the second game in the series. The first game was a Japan-exclusive title released in August 1998 and is largely incomplete. Although every Pokemon is viewable in the 3D Pokédex, only 42 of them were usable in battle. This may be a result of Stadium's focus on fully evolved Pokemon, but some groups were omitted entirely. Oddly, Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, Caterpie, and Weedle are also shown battling in Stadium's credit sequence, despite not being usable in the game itself. The reason for the title's unfinished state was possibly due to a change in direction during production. The game was originally designed for Nintendo 64's disk drive add-on, the 64DD. Nintendo once planned to take advantage of the 64DD's ability to rewrite data, allowing players to add expansion packs. They even outlined plans to alter the gameplay of the Game Boy Pokemon games using the 64DD. Using Stadium's transfer pack, code could be sent to and be rewritten on the 64DD using special expansions. Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto compared the feature with personal computers. He specifically noted how Macintosh computers are identical out of the box, but slowly become more personalized over time. These features were dropped when the game became a regular Nintendo 64 title, which was likely due to the delayed release of the 64DD. The game's unfinished state may also be linked to the competitive Pokemon scene, which the original Stadium was heavily influenced by. The game's release was closely tied to a series of Pokemon tournaments known as the Pokemon League National Convention. The first of these events were held in 1997 and used the Super Game Boy to display battles on a television. The finalists of this tournament had their likenesses appear in both the original Japanese Pokemon Stadium and its international successor. The original Pokemon Stadium was released shortly before the next tournament commenced in 1998 and was used in the event. The game's 42 Pokemon were chosen based on usage data from the previous year's tournament. However, this pool was further restricted by the tournament's rules, which was capped at level 30. This meant that Pokemon which evolved after level 30, such as Venusaur, Charizard, Blastoise, and Dragonite, were deemed illegal. While it seems like a simple promotional tie-in, there may be other reasons why the original Stadium was used in the tournament. According to programmer Shigeki Morimoto, Link battles weren't originally going to be included in Pokemon Red and Green. Up until that point, the Link cable was used exclusively for trading, and the battle system was designed for single player only. Link battles were a last-minute inclusion on the behest of Nintendo, which led to several balancing issues. The original Pokemon Stadium was used in order to fix the balancing issues and counteract some of the game's more dominant strategies. For example, the move Blizzard previously had a 30% chance of freezing the target Pokemon, which often led to a KO. Blizzard's chance to freeze was lowered to 10% in the Stadium games and international releases of Pokemon Red and Blue. Additionally, these tournaments implemented rules that had become standard in many events. One example is the Sleep Clause, which allows only one Pokemon to be asleep at a time. These rules were also used in the Poké Cup in the Stadium series. The game that most Westerners know as Pokemon Stadium was intended to be an expansion to the original game, similar to the F-Zero X expansion kit. Evidence of this can be found in the game's code. Some code refers to features that aren't in the original game, but are present in the International Pokemon Stadium. It's likely that the expansion became a fully fledged sequel following more delays of the 64DD. It's also possible that the international success of the series forced the hands of Nintendo and Game Freak, and made it so they couldn't risk waiting for the release of the 64DD. If they waited too long, and the game was released at a time when Pokemon was less popular, they could stand to lose a lot of money. Whatever the case, Pokemon Stadium broke 1 million sales within 3 weeks of its American release, and the project was a huge success. Beating the Master Ball division of the Round 2 Prime Cup will allow players to teach Pikachu the move Surf. The Pikachu must originate from a Generation 1 game, it must also be selected for the Final Cup battle, and the player can't save while unlocking the feature. Surfing Pikachus were originally much more rare and desirable, with only 20 being given away as prizes in the November 1997 issue of Koro Koro magazine. One of the benefits of having a surfing Pikachu was that users could play a surfing minigame in Pokemon Yellow. If a Pikachu with Surf is evolved into a Raichu, it will ride its own tail in Pokemon Stadium. This Easter egg likely inspired the design of the Alolan Raichu. The Stadium series has a few other interesting secrets. If the player's original Pikachu from Yellow is transferred to Pokemon Stadium, it will say its own name like in the anime, rather than using a Pokemon cry. Additionally, transferring a nicknamed Pokemon into Stadium has a chance of altering their color scheme. Stadium highlights moves that a Pokemon shouldn't be able to learn in purple. Surprisingly, if a Diglett is hacked to learn the move Acid, an attack it can't normally learn, the move is shown in white. This could suggest that Diglett was originally planned to learn Acid at some point. Because the move doesn't fit Diglett's typing, it may have been tied to some kind of event like the Surfing Pikachu. That said, it could just be a simple oversight by the developers. Electabuzz erroneously has 6 digits on each hand in Pokemon Stadium. Funnily, the error wasn't fixed for Pokemon Stadium 2, which simply reused models from the first game. The Japanese version of Pokemon Stadium 2, known as Pocket Monsters Stadium Gold and Silver in Japan, has some functionality with Pokemon Crystal's mobile system. The mobile system allowed for online play by using the Japan-exclusive mobile Game Boy adapter with mobile phones. In Stadium 2, the feature allowed players to record online battles and see them play out in 3D on their TV. All the items that the player's mother can buy in Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal versions can be found in the My Room section of Stadium 2. The player can also keep one of 4 consoles out in their room: an NES, a Super Nintendo, a Nintendo 64, or a Virtual Boy. Depending on which console is active, the TV will show a game from each console. This includes titles from Mario, Zelda, Kirby, F-Zero, Star Fox, and Wave Race. However, no games appear on the screen if the Virtual Boy is out. A teaser for Pokken Tournament renewed interest in Pokemon Stadium, sparking speculation that the series might make a return. When asked about the possibility of a new installment, series producer Junichi Masuda claimed that it was no longer impactful or surprising seeing Pokemon in 3D. Masuda said that Stadium would need to innovate to justify the creation of a new game.
Did you know? Duke Nukem Forever began development as a 2D side-scroller, similar to Duke Nukem 1 and 2. The game's name was kept, but the concept for the game was discarded, marking the beginning of Duke Nukem Forever's infamous 15-year-long development hell. An early version of Duke Nukem Forever used the Quake 2 engine, and was presented at E3 1998, where it impressed many convention-goers. The revelation that Forever would run on id Software's Quake 2 engine shocked fans, as 3D Realms and id Software were often thought of as rivals. The competition between the two studios was even referenced in Duke Nukem 3D's Shrapnel City. In the area's 4th level, an earthquake strikes as the player approaches a tall black building with the sign East Town Towers. Duke says, "I ain't afraid of no quake." This sequence references the real-life Town East Towers in Mesquite, Texas, where id Software's headquarters were located at the time. Duke's line was a stab at id's then upcoming game Quake, which was known to be technically superior to Duke Nukem 3D. Duke Nukem Forever was rebooted again shortly after the 1998 E3 presentation. It was announced that Forever would run on Epic Games' Unreal Engine. During development, it was planned that Forever would feature a sidekick in the form of a gay robot. This was intended to add depth to Duke's character and to explore how the ultra-macho Duke would relate to a peer that has a different sexual orientation. The idea was scrapped, as the whole concept revolved around the robot being the subject of a tragic ending. Gearbox head Randy Pitchford explained the theme of loss and sacrifice were not appropriate for the game, stating, "Duke is all about having a good time. Do you want to pay $60 to feel like crap? No." After multiple delays, director George Broussard revealed some key reasons for Duke Nukem Forever's lengthy development time, citing the complexity of modern game design and his own habit of constantly seeking out new elements to put in the game. It actually became a running joke at 3D Realms to keep Broussard from playing new video games, as he'd want to include portions of them in Duke Nukem Forever. Development continued intermittently over a decade as more and more delays were announced, and Forever won Wired.com's yearly Vaporware Awards numerous times. In 2003, it was removed from Wired's list and given a Lifetime Achievement Award. Sometime before 2009, 3D Realms discontinued internal development of the game. However, 9 ex-employees, including key personnel like Alan Bloom, continued game development from their homes throughout the year. These ex-employees formed Triptych Games, and with the help of funding from Gearbox Software, Duke Nukem Forever was finally released in 2011. One strange result of Forever's extended production was that retailer GameStop was obliged to honor a decade-old pre-order for the game. A gamer that goes by the alias /000 held on to his pre-order from 2001. Not only did he get his long-awaited game, but Gearbox sent him a care package full of Duke Nukem merchandise. The Duke Nukem games are fully loaded with references to movies, music, and other video games. The cover of Duke Nukem 3D pays homage to the iconic cover image for Evil Dead 3: Army of Darkness. And this isn't the only reference to that same film in Duke Nukem. Aside from a few choice quotes, the popular Duke one-liner, "Hail to the King, baby," is taken word for word from the last line in Army of Darkness. Another famous Duke Nukem quote, "It's time to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of gum," was taken almost verbatim from the 1988 John Carpenter film They Live. The Duke Nukem 3D Shrapnel City level Freeway contains a hidden reference to the Terminator series. A flattened, Terminator-looking robot can be found behind the machine press. This references the ending to the first Terminator film, where the T-800 is crushed under a hydraulic press. In the Lunar Apocalypse level Warp Factor, there are a few hidden rooms referencing Star Trek The Next Generation. Duke can find the bridge of the Starship Enterprise and Captain Picard's Ready Room. An additional really ready room can be uncovered inside Picard's Ready Room with a secret stash of dirty videos. There are also a series of references to The Simpsons within Duke Nukem 3D. In the Stadium level, if players either look up or use a jetpack, they can see a blimp which reads Duff Beer, a reference to the Duff Beer brand from The Simpsons. In the second to last level of Duke Nukem 3D Atomic Edition, players can open one of the walls to reveal Homer Simpson's donut-covered desk from the nuclear plant. In the bathroom in level 4-6, Going Postal, a message can be seen written backwards on the wall. Looking at this message in the mirror reveals the text "Pick up Bart," alluding to the Simpsons episode Brother from the Same Planet. A different kind of Simpson reference can be found in the bar level of Red Light District. The TV in the bar displays an image of a white Bronco speeding down the highway. This is similar to O.J. Simpson's real-life car chase that interrupted coverage of the 1994 NBA Finals. Over the years, Duke Nukem 3D was ported to over 11 different platforms, and each port had its own unique features and Easter eggs. In the classic Mac OS version, entering the cheat DN 1984 on the first level will display Big Brother is watching at the top of the screen, and replace the movie playing in the theater with a well-known 1984 Apple commercial. The Lunar Apocalypse level Dark Side contains a reference to Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. In the PC version, players can find a dead Luke Skywalker hanging upside down at the back of a cavern, and in the N64 version of the game, Luke is replaced with Yoda. The N64 version has yet another alteration. In the original Duke Nukem 3D, the babes kidnapped by the aliens were woven into cocoons and tied up on pillars. Pressing the action button in front of them will make them moan, "Kill me," which is a reference to a similar scene in the Alien franchise. In the Nintendo 64 version, the babes' skin were covered up more, and they could not be killed. Instead, the action button will cause the babes to disappear with a message stating "Babe saved."
Did you know? Although he's not a playable character, Diddy Kong is actually in Mario Kart 64. He can be seen by looking closely at the bus in Toad's Turnpike, driving the vehicle. This isn't the only secret surrounding Mario Kart 64. In the earliest stages of the game's development, director Hideki Kono bought some RC cars for testing purposes. After researching their mechanics and physics, his team made a Mario Kart prototype based on a computer simulation of the RC cars. But the prototype ended up feeling too realistic, to the point where it wasn't actually fun. They even had some children try it out, but the kids found it totally unplayable. As a result, the realistic physics were dialed back, and very little from the RC prototype ended up in the game's final build. Later in development, a newer prototype of Mario Kart 64 was shown off at Nintendo Space World 1995 in Japan. At this stage of development, the game was called Super Mario Kart R, with the R standing for rendered, as in rendered graphics. The prototype featured a number of differences compared to Mario Kart 64, and even had some music that was never used in the final game, which is what you're hearing right now. Super Mario Kart R also included Kamek the Magikoopa as one of its 8 races. Kamek was the primary antagonist in Yoshi's Island, the hugely popular follow-up to Super Mario World that launched just a few months prior to Space World, so it made perfect sense for Kamek to appear alongside Bowser and Wario as the game's villains. But one kidnapper ended up getting replaced with another. Kamek was replaced in the final game with Donkey Kong, the vengeful gorilla that kidnapped Mario's girlfriend. Super Mario Kart R also made use of the feather from the original Super Mario Kart on Super Nintendo. After getting cut during development, the feather didn't reappear in the series until Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, 20 years later. In addition to multiplayer horizontal split screen, the prototype also allowed for vertical split screen. This option was also cut during development, but it's still hidden inside Mario 64's internal data. You can even unlock it and take it for a spin with a Game Shark and this cheat code. The development process was long and arduous, and the developers even suffered a hard disk crash at one point, erasing some of their work. But according to character designer Tomoaki Kuroumi, the crash was actually a blessing in disguise. The models on the character select screen were originally static, unable to move or blink, but the crash deleted all those models with no hope of recovery. So the developers had to make brand new models, this time giving them animations, an extra layer of polish that wasn't originally supposed to be in the game. A year after Space World 95, and following an 8-month delay, Mario Kart 64 finally launched in Japan in December 1996. There were quite a few details in the Japanese version that were changed in the game's international release, with one difference right on the title screen. In every other region, Mario is the game's announcer, but in Japan, this role was played by Hawaiian actor and radio host John Houlihan.
Mario Grand Prix!
John told us that Nintendo hired him to voice the announcer on Wave Race 64. Then, after the recording was finished, they slid a piece of paper in front of him without explanation, asking him to record just a little bit longer. That mysterious piece of paper turned out to be the lines for Mario Kart 64. John's agent was pretty mad that he never got paid for the role, and Nintendo even spelt his name wrong in the game's credits. 5 years later, that same recording was recycled worldwide in Mario Kart Super Circuit, even in the English version, without crediting John at all.
Congratulations!
In fact, he didn't even know his voice was used in Super Circuit until we told him. Luigi had been voiced by at least 7 different actors in commercials and television shows throughout the 80s and 90s, but Mario Kart 64 was the first time Luigi ever spoke in a video game. We've talked about Julian Bardakov before. He's the guy who gave the first 251 Pokemon all their French names. A few years before that, however, Julian was translating Super Mario 64 into French at Nintendo HQ. During a break, he was playing Magic the Gathering with a Mario Kart R programmer. One thing led to another, and Julian was invited to take the prototype for a spin. At this point, Toad didn't have a voice yet, so Julian volunteered for the role free of charge. Longtime Nintendo sound director Koji Kondo managed Julian's recording, but afterwards told Julian he didn't really sound like how he imagined Toad. But he did sound like Luigi. So Julian ended up voicing Luigi instead. Wario had never been voiced in a video game before either, so Kondo brought in Julian's friend Thomas Spindler, one of Nintendo's German translators. According to Thomas, Wario was originally conceptualized as a German character, not an Italian. That's why Nintendo brought in a German to provide his voice, and why Wario even speaks German in the Japanese version of Mario Kart 64. He says "so eine Mist," which translate into English as "oh crap." When the game was localized for international release, most of the characters' voices were replaced, including the announcer, Luigi, and Wario. Longtime Mario voice actor Charles Martinet took over all 3 roles, but the original Japanese recordings did end up getting recycled for both the Japanese and international versions of Mario Kart Super Circuit, as well as Mario Party 1 and 2. When Charles Martinet re-recorded the voices for Mario Kart 64, Wario was rebranded as an Italian rather than a German. We asked Charles if he knew anything about Wario originally being German, if maybe it was his decision to change the accent, just like he switched Mario's accent from Brooklyn to Italian a couple of years earlier. Charles said he'd never even heard about Wario being German, so it sounds like the switch to Italian was probably the result of an oversight by the localization team. They gave Charles the script without any notes about a German accent, so he naturally assumed he'd apply an Italian accent, just as he'd already done for Mario and Luigi. Wario has remained Italian ever since, but interestingly, in Mario Strikers Charged, Wario was given a traditional German fare as his theme music. However, it's unclear if this was an intentional reference to his German origins or just a strange coincidence. Most of the game's billboards were changed as well, presumably to avoid trademark issues overseas. In the Japanese version, the billboards were all parodies of Formula One sponsors, like a Mario billboard imitating the Marlboro cigarettes logo. But internationally, the Marlboro reference was cut out. Instead, the signs just say Mario Star. Likewise, parodies of Italian oil company Agip, motor oil brand Mobil 1, and gas station chain Union 76 were also changed. A mock billboard for the Goodyear Tire Company was revised as well, and had been an even more blatant imitation in Super Mario Kart R, where the sign originally said Good Ear. When Mario Kart 64 was re-released on the China-exclusive iQ player in 2003, the game received brand new box art. The game's name was also changed to just Mario Kart, since the N64 never released in China, and neither did the original Mario Kart game on Super Nintendo. The iQ version had some differences as well. The billboards were all translated into Chinese, and the shot billboard was changed to an ad for iQ. The special cup was also renamed the iQ Cup. Mario Kart 64's racetracks have more hidden shortcuts than any other Mario Kart. As well as the usual shortcuts, all but 5 of the game's 16 stages have shortcuts Nintendo never intended, what speedrunners call skips. Common examples of this are jumping over the wall in Wario Stadium or one of the flying leaps on Rainbow Road. In our hunt for secrets, we spoke with Beck Abney, the Mario Kart 64 150cc world record holder. According to Abney, the Japanese version contains a skip not possible in the international release. On Luigi Raceway, you can hit yourself with shells to bounce over a wall and skip about 90% of the race. But there are 3 stages in Mario Kart 64 with tricks that even Abney can't pull off, skips that are virtually impossible for humans. But another speedrunner, Drew Weatherton, spent 7 years perfecting a tool-assisted speedrun that could pull them off. Completing all 16 races in just 18.5 minutes, Abney's the world's fastest racer, but he will never be able to defeat the machines, who have him beat by over 7 minutes. Hidden inside Mario Kart 64's internal data, there's a function that allows you to alter the Y values for every stage. In other words, you can make tracks steeper or flatter by just a little bit, or by a huge amount, including all the slopes, walls, and ramps. You can even invert tracks, so you're essentially racing on them upside down. It's possible the developers created this mechanic just for testing and debugging purposes, but considering the fact it's right next to the flag for mirror mode in the game's memory, the developers may have intended scaling mode as an unlockable extra. Regardless of their intent, the mechanic is still hidden inside the game, and you can try it out for yourself with some GameShark codes we've added to this video's description. There was also a no item mode scrapped during development. In an attempt to appeal to F-Zero fans, racers were given the option to play without items, allowing for more serious competition where carts clumped together in the final lap, edging each other out for fractions of a second. But focus groups much preferred the game with items, so developers just cut the no item mode completely. According to Tadashi Sugiyama, who designed most of Mario Kart 64's stages, there were also some racetracks that were cut during development. One was a large multi-story parking garage, where you'd start at the bottom floor and race up to the top, essentially racing in circles but in an upward trajectory. This was Tadashi's idea for a more realistic location, but all the constant turning made some people feel sick, so they cut it. There was also a track that took place in a huge city with a pond and even a castle, where players raced around different kinds of houses and buildings. But Tadashi says the stage took too long to race through, so the city was scrapped too.
Did you know? Sonic's trademark speed was actually inspired by the original Super Mario Bros. In issue 260 of Nintendo Power, Sonic's co-creator Yuji Naka revealed the initial concept for Sonic the Hedgehog's fast gameplay came from playing level 1-1 of Super Mario Bros. Over and over again as fast as he could, since you always had to play the level first regardless of whether you used warp zones or not. Naka said, "I always tried to get through the level as fast as I could, and that inspired the initial concept for Sonic the Hedgehog." Sonic's design itself had different inspirations. Sonic's shoes were inspired by Michael Jackson's boots and the color scheme of Santa Claus. Sonic's personality was, interestingly, inspired by the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Michael Jackson has other connections to the Sonic franchise. According to Sega Technical Institute director Roger Hector, Jackson was initially brought in during the development of Sonic 3 to compose some music, even though his involvement was never mentioned in any of the game's credits. Jackson's removal was supposedly due to the child abuse allegations against him that arose at that time, and his removal led to the music being reworked. In December 2009, Jackson's composer Bradley Buxer, who is credited in Sonic 3 as Brad Buxer, told French magazine Black and White that Jackson was involved with some of Sonic 3's compositions, and was supposedly not credited because he wasn't happy with how the Genesis' lacking sound chip handled the music. More Sonic games have interesting stories surrounding their soundtracks. Hideki Naganuma, who composed most of the music for Sonic Rush, usually sampled audio from many other mediums when making his music. For Sonic Rush, Naganuma sampled audio from at least 14 other creations. An obvious sample is in the track Back to Back, which uses the main melody from Louie Louie. Others are harder to spot, such as the track Wrapped in Black, which bizarrely uses audio sampled from a speech by human rights activist Malcolm X. Sonic's popularity reached farther than most video game icons. In 1993, Sonic the Hedgehog was chosen to be the first video game character in the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade. Unfortunately, the balloon popped on its one and only flight by being pushed into a lamppost by strong gusts of wind, hurting a child and a police officer on its descent. Because of this, the balloon was retired. A differently designed Sonic came back in 2011 and has been there since. Sonic also won the award of the longest-running video game comic in 2008. Archie Comics made over 200 issues, including specials. Sonic's comic started in 1993 and is still going today. Sonic has even influenced the naming of scientific discoveries. There's a gene called Sonic Hedgehog, named after Sonic himself. The gene also has an inhibitor, something that can stop the process of a gene, named Robotnikinin, named after Sonic's nemesis, Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik. A lot of the content in Sonic games has also been reworked, and sometimes cut entirely. In the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic was going to wear goggles. The goggles can still be found in the game's ROM. It was originally thought they were an item that helped Sonic breathe underwater, but one of the game's developers, Dean Sitton, stated the goggles were simply a cosmetic change and appeared whenever Sonic was underwater. There's also a cut enemy in the game's data named Splats. Splats has no programming attached to it. Interestingly, Splats appeared several times in promotions during Sonic's development. It was featured in a set of promotional trading cards for the game, on the box of a collection of Japanese Sonic figures, and was even featured in Sonic the Comic and Archie Comics' Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic 2 has several cut areas. The most well-known cut area is Hidden Palace Zone. Hidden Palace Zone was never completed, but most of the first act is playable in two of the game's known prototype builds. It was one of the first zones created, but wasn't updated much after the initial phase of development. Yuji Naka revealed the zone was originally going to be a place where the player would warp to after collecting all 7 Chaos Emeralds. The player would then be able to transform into Super Sonic, but the idea was ultimately scrapped and the ability to transform into Super Sonic was given to the player from the get-go. The zone is accessible in the final version of Sonic 2 by using a Game Genie code, but almost all of the artwork is missing and the zone is essentially unplayable. The zone also had 3 enemies that were ultimately unused, 2 dinosaurs resembling some kind of theropod and a stegosaurus, and a bat. There was also a forest level called Wood Zone that seemed to have been worked on for a longer time than the Hidden Palace Zone, and a desert area called Dust Hill Zone. Dust Hill Zone seemed to be based on American deserts and was cut due to time constraints. Another zone named by fans, Rock Zone, was going to be Dust Hill Zone but at a previous point in time. There was also going to be a winter-themed zone based on Dust Hill Zone, where all the cacti were replaced with Christmas trees. Metropolis Zone was originally only 2 acts long, but it became 3 when another zone was reworked and merged with it. This zone was called Genocide City Zone. Level designer Tom Payne said the name was chosen by the Japanese developers, who didn't have a strong grasp on the English language. The zone was renamed to Cyber City Zone to be less offensive before being reworked and merged with the Metropolis Zone. Even entire games in the franchise have been reworked. Sonic 2 and Sonic CD were originally planned to be essentially the same game, as were Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles. Sonic 2 and Sonic CD naturally grew apart and became separate games because the developers were in 2 different locations, but Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles became 2 separate games because of time constraints and manufacturing costs. Splitting the game into 2 parts gave the team more time to finish the second half. The Sonic World level in Sonic Jam was originally going to be a full 3D Sonic game and was actually a prototype for Sonic Adventure. Due to technical issues and the upcoming release of the Dreamcast, the project was moved away from the Sega Saturn in favor of the Dreamcast, and whatever work they had done on the Saturn was turned into Sonic World.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today's episode is going to be all about games that were released for Nintendo's 16-bit machine of dreams, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The SNES was the birthplace of many development companies and franchises that continue to thrive in the gaming market to this day. Without the opportunities development teams had with the SNES at the time of its release, it's likely that many of the series that gamers still know and love would have never existed, or at the very least, would have not been developed into what they are today. One hot title for the SNES that pushed one of Nintendo's franchises further than it had ever reached before was The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The game's subtitle, A Link to the Past, is of course an incredibly clever nod to the game's plot and hero, Link, but this wasn't always going to be the final name for the game. During an interview with Electric Brain magazine back in 1992, Miyamoto provided insights into the game's development, sharing a few names that were juggled around the staff. Some of the titles even sounded like modern takes on Nintendo titles. To avoid the game sharing its name with the original NES Legend of Zelda, one idea was to call the game The New Legend of Zelda, a trend in naming habits that we wouldn't actually see until New Super Mario Bros. On the DS. Another title that was considered was Ganon Strikes Back, which was almost certainly a sly reference to Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. In this same interview, Miyamoto mentioned that the increased power offered by the Super Nintendo allowed their developers to increase the size of Link's adventure, and as a result, it was possible for them to include any leftover ideas they had from the original Legend of Zelda into the new title that the original NES simply couldn't handle. New concepts were considered, but dropped, as despite the Super Nintendo offering more memory, it still wouldn't be enough to fulfill every idea the team created. One such idea was to have fire spread on its own throughout the fields of grass found across Hyrule, a concept that wouldn't truly be implemented until Breath of the Wild, but which has also appeared in a limited fashion in what many consider to be a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, Four Swords Adventures. Another idea was to be able to use the shovel to dig into the ground, but rather than just uncover items, Link would have been able to dig out a canal and introduce it to a body of water to seep water into the man-made canal. Miyamoto also makes a brief mention when asked of any game similar to Zelda that they plan to release. He says, "How about Link's Adventure on the Super Famicom?" This was likely in reference to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, a remake Nintendo was said to have been experimenting with using the Super FX chip. Another franchise that came into its own during the era of the Super Nintendo was Shin Megami Tensei, the original series that would go on to spawn Persona. The third entry in the Megami Tensei series saw players finding themselves in Tokyo Destinyland, a pretty clear parody of Tokyo Disneyland. What the player didn't find, however, was two NPCs which wound up being cut from the game, though they can still be found within its data. These demons depict a mouse and duck wielding swords and a chainsaw respectively. These monsters were likely cut for looking almost exactly like Disney's Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. Even though the intent was to parody the characters, which could be argued as fair use in a court of law, they may not have wanted to risk any legal action from Disney. That said, the two demonic parodies do appear in the PC Engine release of the game, though they've been reworked to distance themselves in appearance from their Super Famicom counterparts. Their names in the game are still a bit on the nose, being referred to as Zombie Mouse and Demon Duck. Speaking of game series with strong cult followings, Star Fox 2 is a pretty fascinating example of a cancelled game that had a continued presence throughout the years, with a post-console digital exclusive release from Nintendo. But some of the game's most interesting elements can't be seen without ripping off the hood and taking a peek at the innards. Argonaut Software did the bulk of the work on Star Fox 2, and were led at the time by Dylan Cuthbert. Cuthbert created many of the tools which were used to make the game, and he also took on the role of lead programmer. This would be pretty evident in the game's data, as it's possible to find a hidden credit within the game's files in the form of a 64-character wide ASCII art that spells out Cuthbert's full name. Another point of interest is a different line of unused text which reads Starglider 01 November 1991. This text is most likely a leftover from the prototype build of the original Star Fox. The early development version of Star Fox, which went under the name Starglider, leaked online in 2020, revealing an interesting stage of the game's creation. The prototype had no title screen or menus. In fact, it doesn't even feature any of the regular Star Fox crew in any form. All that is really available is a version of the game's map, which is pretty different from what would be featured in the final build, and an almost completely different version of the game's soundtrack, with more of an emphasis on a rock style of music. Of course, stages were also very dissimilar from what would be seen in the final game, and several smaller elements would be changed, like the player's R-wing, which originally had extremely thin wings and a rear composed of just 3 polygons. But Star Fox wasn't the only Nintendo franchise that would experiment with 3D visuals. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars is another top-tier game for the SNES, which was noteworthy for its graphics back in the day. The game has many secrets, and we've covered a few of them before, such as the title's regional differences. But since our video on the game a few years ago, many more Japan-only Easter eggs have come to light thanks to Clyde Mandelin's work over at Legends of Localization. The original Super Famicom release has quite a few sly nods to anime hidden within the thoughts of Mario's foe. Mallow, one of the characters that joins the player's party, has the ability to read the minds of enemies in battle, but their thoughts are different between regions. In the English game, the Terrapin enemy is pondering, "Yo, what's going on?" A basic translation that actually removes a reference to Dragon Ball. In the Japanese game, the enemy thinks, "Yo, I'm Nokohei. Are you watching, Grandpa?" With Nokohei being its Japanese name. This not only references the line, "Yo, I'm Goku," which plays at the end of every Dragon Ball episode in the Japanese dub, but the second half of the line alludes to Goku's grandpa, Gohan. The Crook enemy also references a very popular anime, but not in the English game. If the player scans their mind in the Western release, it'll say, "You can't run away, ha!" But the Japanese version says, "Mustn't run away, mustn't run away." This is a reference to Neon Genesis Evangelion's very first episode, where Shinji mutters to himself, "I mustn't run away," over and over again. Even Mario RPG's Hammer Brothers reference anime in their noggins. In the English game, they simply think, "I love my hammer." But in the Japanese game, their minds read, "My hammer tonight is a little bit different, turtle turtle." This is a nod to Lapan III's Goemon, who will say, "My Zantetsuken tonight is a little bit different." Zantetsuken, by the way, is a kind of sword that's either rumored or believed to be able to cut through steel or iron.
Did you know? Some of the textures used for E105 Zeta actually have Dreamcast consoles on them hidden in plain sight. This was likely a later addition during development, as Sonic Adventure wasn't originally a Dreamcast game at all. One of the earliest ideas for the game was a Sonic RPG on the Sega Saturn, but the RPG concept was quickly scrapped. However, the thought of giving the game a stronger emphasis on story, similar to what could be found in an RPG, stuck. Sonic Team decided to stay true to the series' platforming action and rework traditional 2D Sonic mechanics and features into 3D. One example of this is the homing attack, which was introduced to replicate the feeling of easily charging at and bouncing off enemies like in 2D Sonic games. As we mentioned in a previous episode, development of Sonic Adventure jumped to the Dreamcast because the Saturn was becoming a commercial failure. We also mentioned that the game's earlier builds were reworked into the Sonic World segments of Sonic Jam. What wasn't mentioned, however, was just how far into development the Saturn art assets were used. There exists Japanese gameplay footage of Sky Chase Act 2 that uses Sonic and Tails models from the Sega Saturn build. Because of how similar the sequence is to its final iteration, it seems to be running on Dreamcast hardware. Another element we mentioned in a previous video was the possibility of Tikal originally being a playable character, as using a moon jump cheat code can make her jump in the game's cutscenes. Since then, more information has developed showing that both Tikal and Dr. Eggman were partially programmed to be playable and can be selected via hacking. Both characters can only walk around and jump, and they can't interact with enemies and obstacles. In order to research environments for Sonic Adventure, Sonic Team organized a trip to Central and South America. None of the developers had ever seen genuine ruins and jungles before, and tools like the internet were too primitive at the time to find reliable references. The team wanted to make the game world as believable as they possibly could, even going as far as to use their own photographs as textures in the game. Tales' Sandhill subgame was inspired by people boarding on sand dunes in Ica, Peru. Sonic Team weren't even aware the sport existed and were so impressed that they included it in the final game. Another notable shift in the game's development was the inclusion of the often criticized E102 Gamma segments. What's interesting is that these levels were included by fan request. Sonic fans appealed to Sega, asking them to incorporate some sort of shooting mechanic into the series. Sega wanted to satisfy their audience, but felt the shooting gun didn't fit Sonic's character. Sonic Team's solution was to create a new armed character, possibly based on Egg Robo from Sonic & Knuckles. Sega also included a different kind of fan service. In the original Japanese release of Sonic Adventure, a mechanical cowgirl billboard could be seen within Casinopolis, and a moaning sound would play whenever the player touched it. This was replaced with a generic sign in international versions of the game for obvious reasons. This version, however, was also toned down from the Sonic Adventure auto demo prototype. In this version, the girl was a fully fleshed out Playboy-style bunny with a mini-bar. To take advantage of and showcase the Dreamcast power, the team wanted to create a villain that could never have been rendered on previous consoles. In the words of director Takashi Iizuka, "I wanted to create an enemy that hadn't been possible until now. I wanted something bigger, something transparent and liquid, because technology now allowed for it. I wanted something that would wow the users." Chaos is seen from the very beginning of the game to make the graphical leap obvious, and was even included in the opening movie sequence. When Chaos was first designed, the concept art was shown to Sonic creator Yuji Naka. Naka liked the drawing so much that he approved them on the spot. The look of Perfect Chaos was changed in Sonic Generations. It was later explained that this is how Chaos was originally intended to appear, but Sonic Team weren't able to achieve that exact look due to the technical restrictions of the Dreamcast. In Sonic Adventure, Sega had to settle for Perfect Chaos's body being made completely out of water, which was still something unthinkable in the days of the Sega Saturn. The direct inspiration for Chaos's concept and presentation is uncertain. In Greek mythology, Chaos was the name of the first deity to come into existence, and is described as vast and formless. Chaos is put forth as a godlike creature in the game, and one of his key features is changing forms. However, Chaos could have another more scientific inspiration. There's a close relative of the amoeba called Chaos. These organisms can change form, are mostly translucent, and have a noticeable opaque blotch in them accompanied by smaller mitochondria floating around. This seems very similar to Sonic's Chaos, especially how he was depicted in concept and promotional art. Although his real-life origins are ambiguous, Sega have explained Chaos's virtual beginnings on their Japanese website. Chaos is actually a mutated Chao. The Chao themselves were a progression of a feature from Nights into Dreams called A-Life. A-Life involved artificial life forms called Nighttopians, which could be merged with other creatures and even bred. The game kept track of the moods of the Nighttopians, which would alter the tempo, pitch, and melody of the music depending on the state of the Nighttopians within a level. Sega wanted to take this idea of nurturing a creature that grew with the player and migrate it into Sonic Adventure to break up the pace of the game. Not only did they want to mix up the gameplay, but they also wanted people who weren't necessarily good at action sequences to be able to play and enjoy the game. Finding Chao eggs and raising them also imperceptibly made these players better at the game's action sequences and helped them progress. Takashi Iizuka stated, "We really wanted to introduce Sonic to people who weren't good at action games and expand the reach of the game. That's why we included the Chao in the design. We really just wanted to expand the world of Sonic and to expand the game to people who had never had the chance to play a Sonic game before." The Dreamcast version of Sonic Adventure states that Chao Gardens were created in protected environments. However, it's possible to drown in the pools in both the Egg Carrier and Mystic Ruins Chao Gardens. You can also drown in the Dark and Hero Chao Gardens in Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast. This can only be done with Tails though, as he's short and most of his head is submerged. The water was made shallower in Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, making the areas safe again. Sega also changed the Chao Gardens in Sonic Adventure DX for the GameCube. What's confusing about the change, however, is that players can still drown in them even though the problem had been solved in Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, which released the previous year.
Ah, the Super Nintendo. An amazing step forward for the world of gaming. Coming after Nintendo's first home console, many of the core fundamentals of what a home console was had already been established, but the SNES was able to offer more power and more opportunities to progress those fundamentals even further. Everything about the console saw improvements over the NES, with more buttons, more graphical variety, better music, and with that, arguably, better games. Platformers like Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island and Donkey Kong Country 2, fighting games like Primal Rage, and awesome RPGs like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Super Mario RPG. But first, we're going to take a look at one of our favorite titles on the system, Mega Man X. Many new designs and characters were introduced to the Mega Man franchise with this next generation of games. Mega Man X took the original formula and gave it just a little bit of modern spice. Some of that spice included new characters like Vile, a Reploid war machine, who many have compared to other pop culture icons such as Star Wars bounty hunter Boba Fett. Vile's original Japanese name was Vava. which some argued was changed to Vile in international releases out of the fear that Lucasfilm would sue Capcom as a result of Vavar being just a touch too close to boba, with V's and B's sometimes being used interchangeably in Japanese. However, in an interview conducted in 2012, Capcom character designer Tom Pon stated that Vile's design was inspired by another character in pop culture, but not Boba Fett. The true inspiration was Bubba Zanetti from the 1979 George Miller film Mad Max, with Vavar being similar to the transliterated name of the character Baba Zanetti. It would only be later in the Mega Man X series, with the release of Mega Man X8, that Vile's colours were changed from purple to green as a sort of nod to the similarities the character had with Boba Fett. Next up, we're talking about another favourite of ours. Yoshi's Island was a sequel to Super Mario World, with Mario taking on a younger appearance as a baby. But it doesn't seem as though the game was always intended to be a Mario title. With the infamous Giga Leak event, in which many of Nintendo's early assets were leaked online for all to dissect, assets pertaining to Yoshi's Island stood out to many, particularly when it came to its graphics. This includes an early sprite sheet for Yoshi, which didn't even have Mario present. Instead, Mario's role is taken by what appears to be a young wizard. This could lead you to believe that the original plot of the game wouldn't have involved Yoshi saving Mario, but rather Yoshi saving a wizard. Not only does this character have graphics for the main gameplay sections of the game, but even the game's opening, suggesting that this may not have been just a simple generic placeholder character, but rather one that would have had some considerations made. Other unused concepts can be found deep into these archives too, which back up claims made by Miyamoto in a 1995 interview. A sprite sheet for Mario can be found which shows him in his adult state, which, according to Miyamoto, was the original plan for when Yoshi obtained an invincibility star. Instead of baby Mario being given extra power, Mario would have quickly aged to his adult state. The concept was dropped because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The interviewer mentioned that from a sales point of view, a game where you control Mario rather than Yoshi would probably sell more, to which Miyamoto responded with, "Yes, and that's why we added the ability to transform into Super Baby Mario when you pick up a star. In fact, our first idea was that the baby would transform into fully grown, mustachioed Mario when you got the star. But another staff member pointed out how that would be weird with the story, so we kept him as Super Baby Mario. Personally, I still think the idea of adult Mario running around is better." Speaking of mustachioed Mario, Baby Mario's appearance was also altered during development, with graphics existing for the character in a bonnet as a baby, still donning his iconic facial hair. Frankly, it's just a bit unsettling. This next game wouldn't be seen in stores 2 years after it released, all thanks to complaints in the United States. In 1996, a mother from Gilbert, Arizona, started a grassroots campaign to have the SNES port of Primal Rage pulled from store shelves, despite the game having been on the market for 2 years at that point. The campaign had a limited amount of success, with the initial controversy coming about as a result of her 11-year-old son executing Chaos's fatality, the Golden Shower, a move in which the beast finishes off his opponent by urinating on them. A shocking and grotesque finisher for those without a sense of humor. Time Warner Interactive, who published the title, dismissed the claim because the mother decided to go straight to the media as a first port of call, rather than approaching either themselves or the game's developer, Atari. The company managed to prove their point when they decided to resubmit the game for a rating from the ESRB to get a second opinion, where the board decided to give the game a T for teen rating, the same rating that the board had concluded the game should be released with already. Having not changed the rating of their game, Time Warner made a point of chastising the mother for criticizing the game for its content when she willfully ignored the age rating given for the game and let her 11-year-old play a game that was given a rating above his age. Next up, we're talking about the SNES exclusive Uni Racers, or Uni Rally in PAL regions. The game's developers, DMA Design, once had a strong relationship with Nintendo and planned to reference this connection in an earlier version of the game. As seen in pre-release footage from a Nintendo Power Previews commercial, the game's tours were once planned to be named after Nintendo franchises, including The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario, Kirby, Metroid, Donkey Kong, Yoshi, Wario, Star Fox, and one tour was named after the Ultra 64, which was the original name for the Nintendo 64. But this is far from the game's only interesting tidbit. There are 16 different races in the game, each functioning as a save file that you can name. However, some names just won't work. If the player enters a common swear word or a word that's generally taboo, the game will say, "not cool enough," and you'll have to enter a different name. But the devs at DMA went one step further, having a dig at Nintendo's rivals. If the words Sonic or Sega are entered as names, the "not cool enough" prompt will also be triggered. Cheeky boys. The next RPG we're talking about is Super Mario RPG, which also happens to have a ton of references within it, though notably far more in the Japanese version of the game. There was some excellent research done a few years ago by video game translator Clyde Mandelin, where he compared the English dialogue of many enemies to their Japanese counterparts, revealing that the English localization cut out many references to media. But there were a few other things lost in translations as well, direct references to Nintendo games and characters. In the English versions of Mario RPG, the Magikoopa enemies will say, "That's my child?" when a battle starts. This is a bit odd, and seems to be a bare-bones translation of the text that pops up in the Japanese game. Here, the Magikoopa says, "Kyuki, you're that baby from that one time." This is clearly a reference to Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, where a Magikoopa kidnaps baby Mario and Luigi, but drops Mario and tries to recapture him. It seems that the localization staff on Mario RPG didn't get the reference at all, and changed it to something similar, but generic without the original meaning. Another enemy in the game is Gorilla, not to be confused with Donkey Kong, of course. In the English version, this foe's opening text says, "Don't confuse me with someone else," a nod to the fact that this ape has a striking resemblance to DK. However, this is a toned-down version of the original Japanese text, which opens with, "This character has no relation to any persons living or dead. Any resemblance is purely coincidental." The intro text is worded as a legal disclaimer from the developers, rather than a statement from the character, which frankly is far funnier. Though to be fair, the legal disclaimer joke was probably dropped due to text character limitations. The enemy's name was also changed, with the Japanese name being Dosuke Yongu, which sounds like a bootleg version of how Donkey Kong is pronounced in Japanese. Donkey Kongu. Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In today's episode, we'll be exploring more trivia from one of Sega's most beloved consoles, the Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive. We all know that Sega's success was helped in no small part by the creation of their iconic mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. However, one iconic character from the series wasn't initially planned. After the first game on the console became a smash hit, Sega unsurprisingly requested a sequel from the original team. One of the fundamental elements that developer Yuji Naka wanted to be included was some form of multiplayer. Originally conceived as a competitive racing mode, it eventually evolved into what they referred to as a 1.5-player co-op mode too. For this edition, the team needed to come up with a new character, eventually resulting in the creation of Tails Miles Prower. However, to begin with, this character was not a fox, but a tanuki, otherwise known as a Japanese raccoon dog. The initial designs were based on a UFO catcher plush doll, but the design was too clumsy. The decision to change the second character's species was made due to Nintendo having close ties to the tanuki at the time, with tanukis appearing in Super Mario Bros. 3 as a power-up for Mario. To give this fox character more personality, a second tail was added. Making a character for any game can take time, and while most companies follow standard practices when including characters they don't own the rights to, this isn't always the case. This process can sometimes be overlooked, causing problems for companies. Sega referenced characters from other media in their initial release of Revenge of Shinobi, with one boss fight featuring Spider-Man, who, after enough damage, would transform into Batman. The boss fight is implied to be against a ninja capable of shape-shifting, not the actual characters. After this initial publication of the game, a revision was made and released again as version 1.01, this time altering the appearance of Batman into a demon with wings, with a close resemblance to the titular character from the manga series Devilman. This wouldn't be the only revision made, however. Revision 1.02 changed Spider-Man's appearance to more closely resemble the character, and included a copyright notice for Marvel Entertainment after Sega obtained a license to the character for other titles on the console. This change also altered the fight so that, upon being defeated, Spider-Man wouldn't shapeshift. He would flee instead, implying he was the actual character and no longer a shapeshifter. After the license for the character expired, another version was made for the Wii Virtual Console. This version changed Spider-Man to have a pink costume instead, making him a totally different and unique character. This 1.04 version is now used for all re-releases of the title. The reason for Spider-Man's original appearance in the game was explained by Noriyoshi Oba, who said Sega had already acquired copyright permission for the Spider-Man arcade game they were developing. We were actually asked by Sega to include Spider-Man as part of the promotional effort for that game. In that case, we were actually told to make him look more like Spider-Man. Other characters were also altered in these subsequent versions. In the game's initial release, enemies with flamethrowers were named Rocky in the Japanese manual, and took on the appearance of Rambo, two characters portrayed by Sylvester Stallone. After the first update, their design was changed to feature sunglasses and male pattern baldness. The boss of Round 7 was also changed, with the original release being a representation of Godzilla until it was changed in Revision 3 to simply remove his skin. Speaking of legal changes, one title released by Sega had the license changed after creative differences between then Sega Studio Camelot and Climax Entertainment. Landstalker, The Treasures of King Knoll, wasn't initially created as a new property, and was actually intended to be the third entry in the Shining Force franchise, before Shining Force 2 under the name Shining Rogue. Fans of Shining Force have noted that many references to Shining Force can be found throughout the Landstalker series, such as Yogurt's Ring making an appearance in the Dreamcast sequel, Time Stalkers. Going back to Landstalker, there's actually a scene which was cut from international releases. At one point in the game, it's possible to stumble across Kayla enjoying a nice, relaxing bath, before she offers Nigel the opportunity to join her. Though given the option to say yes, Friday will prevent the player from doing so. While this scene was cut during localization, the scene was still translated in the game's code, but was impossible to encounter due to a maid being placed in the bathroom's doorway. By removing the character in the game's code, or by way of a cheat device, it's possible to still gain access and sneak a quick peek. Sound effects are another important part of any good title, though their creation and implementation are often overlooked. With Sega's Golden Axe, it appears that those in charge of creating the death sounds took inspiration from classic 1980s action films. In the Mega Drive version, one of the death cries is actually just a digitized version of a scream from Conan the Barbarian. It wouldn't just be first-party Sega games found to be lifting content from strange places. Metal Fangs, by Victor Musical Industries, was released exclusively in Japan, following a group of cyberpunk-styled races. Hardcore Gaming 101 has uncovered a major inspiration for many of the game's characters: the music industry. Many portraits were simply traced from photos of iconic musicians, and given the cybernetic treatment. Some of these may be speculation, but the website suggests the images include Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, Madonna, David Bowie, Angus Young of AC/DC, MC Hammer, Robert Smith from The Cure, Morrissey, and Adam Horovitz from the Beastie Boys. Another game on the system with an interesting musical reference, amongst other things, is Contra Hardcore. This music reference appears in a secret ending found during Stage 3, after talking to a man on top of a climbable wall. The man offers the player a chance to participate within the battle arena, where the player will enjoy a remix of Vampire Killer from Konami's other series, Castlevania. Here, 3 bosses must be defeated. They include a disco robot who, after being defeated, will explode into fish pastries, a robot zombie dinosaur pushing a carriage holding a machine gun with a large slime monster inside, and a robot brain which can warp around the room. After defeating these bosses, the player is sucked into a magical portal and sent back in time to the age of dinosaurs. Several years after, the player finds themselves as the king of monkeys, before the game's credits roll. Another Mega Drive game which makes reference to another game on the system is Ranger X. In the game's Japanese release, there's a secret easy difficulty mode that can be unlocked by going to the options screen and inputting ABC, ABC, ABC. Not only does the whole game become significantly easier, but an additional stage is added prior to level 1, which differs from the title's usual dark and moody tones to a more light-hearted parody of several Sega titles like Alex Kidd and Sonic the Hedgehog. Another interesting, and slightly bizarre cheat, comes from the Genesis release of ESPN National Hockey Night. The game contains a cheat that strips the game down to a one-on-one game of Pong. This can be done by entering B, C, 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 up, down on the main menu. However, the original aesthetic of the classic Pong isn't present. The puck does remain the same, but the paddles have been replaced by 2 hockey players. If this still resembles Pong just a little bit too much, the player can enter an additional code on the main menu, ACB, up, right, and up, to replace the puck with an octopus for some reason. Phantasy Star 2, the sequel to the Master System classic, has an interesting regional difference. Ust-Vestia, a piano teacher found in the northwest outskirts of Oputa, will play music for the party, acting as a sound test board so players can listen to the game's soundtrack. He's also capable of teaching the music technique to anyone in the party. In the game's English version, if a male party member wants to learn the skill, Ust-Vestia will state he looks smart and gives the character a reduced fee of 2,000 compared to the 5,000 he charges for female characters. The Japanese version of the game reveals the reason for this gender disparity. Ust-Vestia will instead state he looks cute and is openly homosexual. This was altered for the game's English release, possibly to avoid contention from players who find the image of 2 men having steamy, passionate coitus uncomfortable. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. Today, we'll be exploring the first release of Duke Nukem. While the game was initially released with Duke's surname as Nukem, the game's version 2.0 release changed the spelling of this name to Nukem with a U. The change was made after Apogee, the game's developer, became concerned about the copyright of the name Duke Nukem. So, when the 2.0 version of the original Duke Nukem released, the name was altered to avoid legal issues. The character they thought might cause problems was also called Duke Nukem, the eco-villain and radioactive mutant from the beloved cartoon series Captain Planet and the Planeteers. However, when programming Duke Nukem 2, they came to the conclusion that there was no copyright over the name, and so the original name was reinstated.
Did you know? In the Japanese version of Super Smash Bros., the beam sword sounds very similar to the lightsabers from Star Wars. However, these effects were swapped out for less recognizable sounds in the game's international release. Since Star Wars: The Phantom Menace was set to release less than a month after Smash Bros. In the States, the change was likely made to avoid legal action from Lucasfilm. Interestingly, sounds of the beam sword would later go back to resembling lightsabers in international versions of Brawl and Smash 4. Characters in the Japanese release also had somewhat realistic punching and kicking sounds for their attacks. These were replaced with more slapstick sound effects in the West, likely to guarantee the game a child-friendly rating. There's also an unused voice clip of the announcer saying Jigglypuff in the Japanese game. Its presence is interesting, as Jigglypuff is only called by its native name Purin in the Japanese game. The presence of this clip might suggest that Smash Bros. Was intended for an international release before it was even finished. Speaking of unused names, Super Smash Bros. Was nicknamed Pepsi Man early in production. This is because the game originally used metallic-looking featureless characters that resembled Japan's Pepsi mascot, Pepsi Man. These figures ended up being temporary combatants and were only used to program the game in its initial stage. The game was officially referred to as Kokuto Game Ro during development, which roughly translates as Dragon King, the fighting game. The project got this title from the Ruo town area where its developers, HAL Laboratory, were located. The game's creator, Masahiro Sakurai, wanted to offer an alternative to popular fighting games and make a game where every play session was unique. In the beginning, there were only 3 people working on the prototype. Sakurai was in charge of game design and graphics, another developer handled sound design, and Satoru Iwata, who was president of HAL at the time, programmed the game in his spare time. Sakurai took pictures of the Ruo area and used them as backgrounds in the game, which can be seen in early screenshots. At least 2 other levels were conceptualized while the game still used featureless characters. These levels can be seen in the book Think About Video Games, but it's unclear if they were planned to be playable areas or simply illustrations. During this early stage, the team had trouble defining the game's world and giving it an identity. In an Iwata Asks interview, Sakurai explained, "You have to have some main characters in a fighting game, and when you line up character 1, 2, 3, and so on, the main characters end up blurring together. With a game for the arcade, it's okay for character development to take a back seat since players are content with the fighting. For the home console, however, you have to set up the general atmosphere of the gaming world right from the start or else the game suffers. That's why I asked to use Nintendo characters." When Iwata appealed to Nintendo executive Shigeru Miyamoto to use Nintendo characters, Miyamoto refused. Iwata didn't tell Sakurai about his conversation with Miyamoto and asked Sakurai to create a demo anyway in hopes of changing Miyamoto's mind. A prototype featuring Donkey Kong, Samus, Fox McCloud, and Mario was made and presented to Miyamoto, as they were the easiest to fit into the existing engine. The demo went over well, and the team was given permission to use Nintendo characters. The final game had even more characters, and 8 were unlocked from the start. Their arrangement on the character select screen even holds a secret as they're placed in chronological order. Mario and Donkey Kong first appeared in 1981, Link and Samus debuted in 1986, Yoshi in 1990, Kirby in 1992, Fox in 1993, and Pikachu in 1996. The 4 unlockable characters are also arranged chronologically. Luigi debuted in 1983, Captain Falcon in 1990, Ness in 1994, and Jigglypuff in 1996. In addition to the 12 characters that made it into the game, there were several that had to be cut. Both Mario's Bowser and Kirby's King Dedede were being worked on during development, but were dropped. There were also plans to include Mewtwo in the game, though the character apparently never made it into actual production. In an interview for the book Making of Fire Emblem 25 Years of Development Secrets, Sakurai revealed that he initially wanted Marth to be playable in the original Smash Bros. As well. He wanted to include Marth so that players had a choice when it came to sword-wielding characters. Since Link is a swordsman that uses brute force, the more technique-oriented Marth would add variety. The desire to include Marth in Smash 64 is also why he was planned to appear in Super Smash Bros. Melee from the start of Melee's development. Unfortunately, heavy time constraints meant that Marth had to be left out. These constraints were so restricting that the only reason the game's unlockable characters made the cut was because they reused existing assets. Captain Falcon reuses animations from Samus and arguably kept the same structure as the project's original featureless characters. Luigi and Jigglypuff also reused several elements from Mario and Kirby. The game was originally planned for a Christmas 1998 release, which gave the team a little over a year to make it. Super Smash Bros. Slipped back to a January 1999 release in Japan, and wouldn't see an international release until months later. The game's stages also had harsh restrictions. Artists would have to try and keep a level's geometry under 150 polygons, which is about a fifth of the polygons used in Mario's model for Super Mario 64. They generally succeeded, and most levels in the game use less than 200 polygons. Although they had harsh limitations, the team still had some fun while making levels. Sakurai's wife, Michiko, worked on the project several years before they married. Michiko mentioned that she put the Buzzy Beetles into the final Mushroom Kingdom stage without getting approval, and no one noticed. The stages also changed over the course of development. The Metroid level was originally very different. Players would have fought on a satellite orbiting a star, but the team went with a level that better represented the franchise. There's also 2 unused stages in the game's data that were used to test the game. The first features a triangle of stationary wooden platforms, and the second is much larger, with several floating platforms. Both stages are similar to Dreamland, but have multiple textures and objects not seen anywhere else in the game. The Dreamland stage was one of the earliest stages to be made, which is likely why it was used for testing. The stage even kept the same layout from the original stage design in Dragon King, the fighting game. The level where the player fights Metal Mario and the Race to the Finish minigame stage both have unused spawn locations for 4 characters. This seems to suggest that they were a part of the game's multiplayer multiplayer at one point in development. Sakurai has also stated that he originally intended to include the final smashes from Brawl in the N64 game. This is further evidenced by the game's data, which holds unused final smash sounds for Samus, Kirby, Fox, Pikachu, Captain Falcon, and Ness. Some of these sounds were even reused in Brawl. The game has other unused ideas. When designing the credits sequence, Sakurai took inspiration from the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland. His original idea was to have the player running down a dark tunnel while holding a flashlight, and people's names would suddenly pop out. The player could then shoot the names, causing them to explode. This idea was scrapped, as blowing up the names seemed disrespectful to the people who worked on the game. Interestingly, Charles Martinet, the voice actor for both Mario and Luigi, had his name misspelled in the credits as Charles Martinet.
Did you know the original idea behind the first Tomb Raider game was to create an action-adventure title that would play like an interactive movie? To do this, designer Toby Gard wanted to make an entirely three-dimensional game. Pseudo-3D games from the early 90s only created the illusion of 3D, which was done by scaling 2D sprites to appear to be various distances from the player. This method used up less processing power than true 3D, which was difficult to achieve at the time. At the start of Tomb Raider's development, getting the 3D character to interact with the game's 3D environment proved to be tough. This issue was only resolved after the team decided to build the game world on a grid system. The game started its life on Sega Saturn development kits, but was ultimately developed simultaneously for the Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. The game released on the Saturn first, thanks to an exclusivity deal with Sega. After the initial release, several bugs were discovered that affected both versions of the game, but since the team had more time to work on the PlayStation version, these bugs were fixed, and the Sony release of Tomb Raider was easily the superior of the two. The rocky start on the Saturn could be why no additional Tomb Raider games were released on the console. In the spirit of designing a game based on action, the original star of Tomb Raider was heavily inspired by the male movie character Indiana Jones. The team was actually planning on letting players choose between two characters early on, a man or a woman. This idea came from another game of the era, Virtua Fighter. While watching people play Virtua Fighter, Gard saw that even though the game only had two female characters, they were often selected for matches. The female character that players could choose was Laura Cruz, who was a hardened, militaristic Latina. Gard was inspired by pop artist Nana Cherry and comic book character Tank Girl while designing Cruz, which can be seen in various stages of her development. However, some members of the team thought it would be more appealing to their European players if the main character was quintessentially British. After searching through a phone book for ideas, they settled on the name Lara Croft. The team eventually realized that making two characters would be a lot of extra work and decided to remove the male character as Gard liked Lara more. Gard went through about 5 designs before finalizing Lara's appearance, including the earlier Laura Cruz character. Lara's dual pistol wielding was also inspired by the film Hard Boiled and the original Aeon Flux. Lara Croft was always intended to be an archetypal heroine, but her sexualized figure was partly due to an accident. During development, Toby Gard made her breasts 150% larger than intended and was told to keep it that way for the final game. However, this origin story for Lara's chest may have been fabricated by Gard to make his intentions seem less lecherous. Programmer Gavin Rummer told Eurogamer, Toby was obviously trying to make her sexy because that was meant to be part of her character. He always claims he slipped on the mouse and made the breasts bigger than he meant to, but how true that is, I don't know. The sexualization of Lara Croft didn't stop there. Fans eventually created a site called nuderaider.com, which hosted a PC patch for Tomb Raider, which made Lara appear naked. Publisher IDOS was falsely accused of suing gamers who used the Nude Raider patch, but IDOS simply sent cease and desist notifications to nuderaider.com, enforcing their copyright of Tomb Raider. Sites depicting nude images of Lara Croft were also shut down, and IDOS acquired the rights to the Nude Raider domain. However, it has since been re-registered and now points to a generic adult-themed search engine page. Although Tomb Raider's developers abandoned their Indiana Jones as characters early on, they never forgot the original source of inspiration. They've even included a number of Easter eggs devoted to Indy throughout the Tomb Raider franchise. In the original Tomb Raider, the Ark of the Covenant from Raiders of the Lost Ark is in the main hall of Croft Manor. In Tomb Raider 3, the treasure room in the manor contains a golden idol that closely resembles the idol from the opening scene in the first movie. Rich Morton, lead level designer for Tomb Raider 3, said the idol was made to look like a cross between the Raiders idol and IDOS producer Mike Schmidt Schmidt. In Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation, Jones's skeleton can be seen in a spike pit in Angkor Wat. Indy's hat and whip make another appearance in Tomb Raider Anniversary, appearing on the side of a large boulder in the tomb of Qualopec. Indiana Jones isn't the only famous explorer Tomb Raider pays homage to. In Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, it's possible to find the remains of Uncharted's Nathan Drake. Here's another interesting reference in the series. In the high-security compound level in Tomb Raider 3, movable crates have MJ-12 printed on them. This is a reference to a conspiracy theory about a secret government organization called Majestic 12, whose job was supposedly recovering and researching alien spacecraft. The organization, said to be created by President Truman, has cropped up in a number of places in pop culture, including TV shows like The X-Files and Dark Skies.
Did you know? Neversoft, the company behind Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, originally developed games for a toy company. After departing a small video game development company owned by Malibu Comics called Malibu Interactive, Joel Jewett, Mick West, and Chris Ward founded Neversoft Entertainment. They first found work with Playmates Toys, developing a Sega Saturn game based on the television show Skeleton Warriors. As development continued, Neversoft grew, and by 1996, the staff consisted of over 20 people. Unfortunately, the days ahead were less than favorable. Neversoft worked for Crystal Dynamics on a game based on Ghost Rider, but it was cancelled due to financial problems. They then began to design their own game, an action-packed shooter called Big Guns. The project was bought by Sony Computer Entertainment, who then began to make changes. Big Guns was renamed to Exodus, and the design was changed from a mech shooter to an action-adventure game featuring a girl who morphed into a cat creature. Sony canceled the game in November of 1997, and Neversoft shrunk down to just 12 employees. In January 2008, Neversoft was nearly out of funds, but was saved by Activision. Activision was looking for someone to develop a game called Apocalypse and saw promise in the Big Guns game engine. Neversoft signed on to design Apocalypse, and Activision also requested Neversoft to develop a prototype of a skateboarding game. Development was mainly focused on creating Apocalypse, but the skateboarding prototypes that were made impressed Activision, and after development on Apocalypse had finished, the 15-man team began working on what would later be named Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. The first person to ride a board in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was none other than Bruce Willis. Neversoft started development using the same engine they made for Apocalypse, in which Bruce Willis played the main character. His character model was the first to ride around on a board during the early stages of the games. In fact, Bruce Willis was still on the board when they took the game's first demo to Tony Hawk to try and convince him to join the project. In a quote from co-founder Joel Jewett, he recalls showing Hawk the demo. The first demo, the one we showed to Tony Hawk to get him on board, had Bruce Willis on a skateboard. He was still holding a gun, I think. As the project moved forward, Bruce Willis's model was taken off the board, but lived on for a short while in the downtown level as a statue, which was completely removed by the time of release. Tony Hawk wasn't just a face and a name, though, and after signing his likeness over to Neversoft, he took on an active role in the game's development. Each time Neversoft finished a new build of the game, a copy was sent to Tony Hawk for review. If he saw anything that didn't appear to accurately reflect the skateboarding scene, he would report back to Neversoft. He also participated in motion capture for the game, a process that was mostly abandoned by the time that the second game was released, however would eventually be reincorporated in later Tony Hawk's installments. Customers first got their hands on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater in the form of a demo that appeared on multiple demo discs, including the PlayStation Underground's Jam Pack Summer '99 disc, and a disc given out at Pizza Hut restaurants. The demo allowed players to control Tony Hawk and Bob Burnquist, and featured either the Chicago or warehouse level. The demo was available over 4 months before the full game actually came out, and provided Neversoft with valuable feedback on what changes needed to be made to the finished product. The demo discs also helped create excitement for the game, which contributed to its success upon release. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater first appeared on the PlayStation on August 31st, 1999. In some regions, it was released as Tony Hawk's Skateboarding, as the word skater implies ice skating in some countries. It was then ported to the Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and N-Gage, and an adaptation was released for the Game Boy Color. Not all of the content that was originally intended for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater made it into the game, and not all ports of the game are identical. An early beta version of the game reveals content that was changed or completely removed from the official release. Aesthetic differences between the beta and final release include a change to the splash screen and logo, different fonts on the end run menu, and that the trick called Fast Plant was originally called Foot Plant. The bonus point items look different as well, appearing as glowing rings in the beta instead of the metallic point icons that appear in the final release. The game's beta also contains 2 levels that were removed completely. The first, a level called Downhill, was a long level without much to do. The objective was to pick up tapes, and although a lot of work appeared to have already been done on the level, it never made it into the final game. The second level, Freeway, was mostly empty. It consisted of part of a highway overpass and not much else. The player could hop off and skate around below the freeway, but it was clear that not much work had been completed on the level, and it was eventually abandoned. Users claiming to have obtained a hacked version of the beta also accessed an area called Test Level. This mysterious and eerie level was mostly devoid of color and had strange physics, allowing the player to ride completely upside down. There is little information available on this level aside from the claim that it was hacked from a direct rip of the beta. Another hacker claimed to be able to skate around the beta levels as a taxi, and even provided a handful of screenshots. Some levels that did make it into the final build of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater had to be scaled back. Both the San Francisco and downtown levels had hidden areas that had to be removed because of size constraints. The ports of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater weren't all identical. Due to the smaller amount of memory available on its cartridges, the Nintendo 64 version had fewer music tracks than the PlayStation version, and some of the songs were reworked and looped to save space. There were also a few changes put in place to accommodate the Nintendo 64's younger user base. Blood was removed, and the names of some of the gaps and transfers were made more appropriate, such as the Handy Gap being changed to the Spanky Gap, the Long Ass Grind being renamed to the Big Daddy Grind, and the Holy Shit becoming Holy Cow. A mysterious cheat code was also put into the Nintendo 64 port of the game. Once it was entered, it would present the player with a black and white photo of a girl. Many have speculated this to be Tony Hawk's then wife Erin Lee, although it doesn't appear to have ever been confirmed, and the code was simply referred to as Girl's Picture. The Dreamcast version of Pro Skater came out on June 29th of the year 2000, nearly a year after it appeared on the PlayStation and mere months before the sequel was released. Despite this, the port received widespread acclaim and was seen by many critics as the best version of the game. The port featured better graphics, more animations, and the Dreamcast VMU displayed score and ratings as the player accumulated points.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In this episode, we'll be exploring trivia for games released on Sega's penultimate console, the Saturn. Things initially seemed set for Sega in their race to dominate the video game console market. They already ran one of the most successful arcade machine manufacturing businesses and had previously made a home console with extensive third-party support, resulting in the overwhelmingly popular Mega Drive, or Genesis for the Americans. It seemed like all Sega had to do was just keep on the same track, but little did they know, a third player was set to join the race. Sony. Feeling the threat of the PlayStation's superior graphical capabilities, Sega couldn't think of a better solution to improve their chances of success than to simply stick in another graphics processing chip into their next-gen console. However, this could also be the exact reason why Sega failed so miserably. As a result of this additional graphics card, the Saturn became notoriously difficult to develop for. The system rendered geometry using quadrilaterals, while Sony and Nintendo opted to have their system render 3D using triangles. This led to many Saturn games using a workaround of rendering square-shaped geometry, but simply setting one side's length to 0. While this meant that shapes were capable of being less boxy on the system, it did result in issues of textures being warped or distorted. Another issue the system faced was transparency, with developers often opting to use a checkered dithering effect instead of having anything semi-transparent. Although with the reality of the television sets of the period, blurring would diminish this checkerboard effect, making it look closer to transparency than it would appear on a modern display. One game that suffered as a result of the console's limitations was the widely ported id Software title Doom. While there was the issue of monsters appearing semi-transparent in most versions of the game now being turned into some kind of chaotic checkers board, many other issues with the port could have actually been fixed, but it was the choice of John Carmack to not fix them. Jim Bagley, a coder who worked on the port, managed to achieve decent results on the game using the Saturn's 3D hardware, but since Carmack wasn't a fan of the effects this rendering style had on the game's visuals, he argued to have the feature removed. Because of this, the game had to run almost entirely on the system's CPU, resulting in a significant reduction in both the game's resolution and the frame rate. Carmack has publicly stated that he regrets this decision, and that in hindsight, he should have been more open to experimentation. The first Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Saturn, Sonic 3D Blast, was simply a port of the already created Sonic 3D released on the Genesis. That said, the port clearly had some extra care and effort put in, as there are some differences like all new weather effects, redrawn graphics to increase detail and colour depth, as well as new animations to the game's scenery. The special stage was also entirely replaced, with the Saturn using a fully 3D half-pipe minigame inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog 2's bonus stage. What's pretty amazing about the Saturn version, however, is that this edition only took 2 months to port across. The reason for Sonic 3D's existence on the Saturn is also due to the cancellation of another Sonic title that was being created, Sonic Extreme, which we've covered previously on the channel. Sega wanted to make sure a new Sonic title was available for the Saturn in time for the holiday season. Sonic 3D Blast wasn't the only well-received port on the system. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is perhaps one of the most highly praised games in the series, cementing the Metroidvania genre in the hearts of gamers worldwide. The game was initially released on the PlayStation, and of course the Saturn, although exclusively to Japan. Since then, it's been ported to a huge array of platforms, but the Saturn version includes a number of extra areas and features unavailable in the PlayStation game. Most infamously, the Saturn version has the underground garden, the entrance of which can actually be seen in the PlayStation version, though it is inaccessible. The player can glitch the PS1 version into allowing access to this area, but it's unfinished, and only a glitched out save point is available. One reason many Saturn players actually bought the console was to get arcade quality graphics in their living room with titles like Virtua Fighter, a series that just so happens to have quite a few interesting Easter eggs and references. For instance, the character Lao Chan, who debuted in the original Virtua Fighter, was actually inspired by Mercenary Tao, also known as Tao Pai Pai, from the original Dragon Ball manga and anime. Lao was even once named Tao Chan, likely a combination of Tao Pai Pai and Jackie Chan. This connection also extends to Lao Chan's daughter, Pai Chan. Virtua Fighter's Jackie Bryant is also likely based on Trunks' Super Saiyan form from Dragon Ball Z. We say this because the game's designer, Seiichi Ishii, once stated in an interview that Jackie was inspired by a Super Saiyan from Dragon Ball, and out of all the Saiyans that could achieve this form, Jackie best lines up with Trunks. Another arcade title that graced the Saturn was The House of the Dead, notable at the time for being a game aimed at an adult audience. According to an interview in the May 1997 edition of Japan's Sega Saturn magazine, House of the Dead's director Takashi Oda specifically wanted the game to target adult gamers. To do this, the team made sure no children or teens appeared in the game so that they wouldn't have to tone the violence down. Oda said, "I did that because our target audience was adults and up. From the start of the project, we knew we didn't want children playing this game. Had we wanted to target them, I think we would have made the game more about ghosts or something, not zombies." Those considerations are one of the tougher parts of this development. Interestingly, the game was also one of the early pioneers of motion capture. Around half the animations in the game came from motion captured actors pretending to be zombies, but the animations ended up looking a bit too human, and the team had to manually tweak them a bit to be more exaggerated and zombie-like. While some Saturn games were cancelled altogether, other games simply had content that was locked between regions. Power Slave, a first-person shooter developed by Lobotomy Software, contained an Easter egg exclusive to the Sega Saturn port, a mini-game called Death Tank. To unlock the secret game, the player must collect all of the hidden team dolls found throughout Power Slave. This multiplayer title was inspired by Scorched Earth, though shifted gameplay from turn-based to real-time. It was created as a hobby project on the side by Ezra Dreisbach, who put it together in his spare time. Both he and Lobotomy Software co-founder Brian McNeely had an ongoing rivalry over the game, playing it every day religiously. Rather impressively, the game actually supported up to 7 players through the use of the Sega Saturn multitap. However, the minigame wasn't available within PAL versions of Power Slave, known as Exhumed, as it was released before the NTSC version and before Death Tank had been completed. That said, the game would go on to have more life after this, with an updated version titled Death Tank Zwei appearing exclusively within another port of a title released on the system, Duke Nukem 3D. To unlock the next entry to this Easter egg minigame, the player must either have a Quake or Exhumed save game file on their system, or destroy every toilet found through Duke's journey.
Did you know? The Turok franchise actually started in 1956. The series got its start as a comic book, with the original storyline centered on a pair of Native American brothers named Turok and Andar, who become trapped in a mysterious valley inhabited by dinosaurs. The initial run of comics lasted until 1982, but the series was revived a decade later by Valiant Comics in a story that introduced the Lost Lands setting, which was popularized by the Turok video games. Following the purchase of Valiant Comics by Acclaim, another reboot of the comic was published in 1998. It developed the story to be more in line with the video game series and changed Turok from the main character's name to a title meaning Son of Stone. As a longtime developer for Nintendo platforms, Acclaim was approached by Nintendo to make a game exclusively for the N64 before the console's release. The project was given to a relatively inexperienced team at Iguana Entertainment led by first-time lead designer David Dinespire. When they started out, the Turok team had few resources, but interest in the game skyrocketed after a successful demonstration at E3 1996. In an interview with Edge magazine, Dinespire recalled, "We were having a real hard time getting dev kits from Nintendo, and we only had 2 of those really expensive CGI machines. All of the artists and designers were sharing one, and our lead programmer had one in his office so he could write the game engine and test it. After that E3 demo, development systems suddenly started turning up. It was great." Internally, there were concerns about the game's graphic violence and blood, as Nintendo is known for family-friendly titles. However, the team was never once asked to submit content for approval, and developed Turok without interference from Nintendo. While brainstorming the initial concept for Turok, the devs wanted to make something that showed off the power of the Nintendo 64. They also took note of the growing shooter genre of games on the PC and decided the game should be an FPS. Turok proved to be technologically groundbreaking. The scope of its world and the complexity of its animations were unlike anything seen in other console shooters. This was achieved in part due to Acclaim having spent $10 million to construct their own motion capture studio, used for several video game projects throughout the 90s. Their studio was even borrowed for some Hollywood pictures, including Batman Forever and Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Motion capture allowed the Turok devs to overcome their limited resources and incorporate highly detailed character animations into the game. They gave generic enemies unique animations that changed depending on how they died. While this worked well for the humanoid enemies, the game's dinosaurs were a much greater challenge. The team tried using emus and ostriches as motion capture stand-ins, but this proved impractical. Still, Remington Scott, the then interactive director for Acclaim, maintains that having an emu as a reference improved the game's final dinosaur animations. Despite all the hype leading up to its release, Turok represented a risky venture for Acclaim. The company lost over $200 million in fiscal year 1996 and were forced to lay off 100 employees. The game's mature rating and the hefty $80 price tag caused some analysts to doubt the game's potential. In the end though, Turok overcame these drawbacks and was a massive hit, selling more than 1.7 million copies. The mayor of Glen Cove, New York, the city where Acclaim was based, even temporarily renamed a street Turok Boulevard in honor of the game's launch. Nintendo themselves recognized the game's success by featuring Turok as part of their Player's Choice line, the first third-party game to receive the honor. The game was successful enough that Sculptured Software, another studio owned by Acclaim, started testing the possibility of porting Turok to the PlayStation, though ultimately nothing came of it. Before Turok was even released, Acclaim announced pre-order sales for the game were so strong that they were already starting development on a sequel, tentatively titled Turok Dinosaur Hunter 2. The team at Iguana was careful to listen to fan feedback, who asked for improved controls and a multiplayer mode. Despite this, the multiplayer mode almost didn't make the cut. Turok 2 originally started development on a 12MB cartridge that filled up quickly. Storage limitations, cartridge prices, and a tight development schedule made multiplayer near impossible to include. Fortunately, cartridge prices dropped and the team was able to move the project to a larger 16MB cartridge. As multiplayer modes and games grew to be a major incentive for players, Turok 2's development time was extended to allow for multiplayer to be included. One of the most common complaints from fans about the first Turok was its control scheme. According to Dynstyber, the plan for Turok 2 was to include two control schemes, one based on Turok and one more familiar to fans of GoldenEye. This can be seen quite literally in an early demo build of the game that offered two control setups named Turok and Golden. These were renamed to Expert and Arcade for the final release. Other differences in the demo included the presence of checkpoints, which were later removed, and a complete lack of blood. Players were also unable to climb down ladders in the demo and could damage themselves with their own weapons. Some elements of Turok 2 took inspiration from other sources. In an interview with IGN, Dynstyber confirmed the cerebral bore weapon was inspired by the iconic Sentinel spheres from the Phantasm horror movies. This isn't the only referential weapon in the franchise though. Dinosaur Hunter's fusion cannon is likely based on the BFG 9000 from Doom, which was a large inspiration for Turok's developers. And Turok Rage War's Chestburster is likely a nod to the Alien franchise. The title Chestburster is usually given to the second stage in a xenomorph's life cycle when it bursts out of the host's chest. Both Turok and its sequel were eventually remastered by Night Dive Studios and released on digital stores like Steam and GOG in 2015 and 2017 respectively, as well as on the Switch and Xbox later on. The Turok 2 remaster contains several unused levels in its data, though most of these were meant for testing purposes. One of the levels, named Not Dwango, is a recreation of a popular fan-made multiplayer map from Doom 2 known as Dwango. The name Dwango is an acronym for Dial-Up Wide Area Network Game Operation, an online gaming service from the mid-90s that became popular enough to use with the Doom games. The Not Dwango map was removed from Turok 2 with the release of a later update. As part of the same update, a level editor was added to the game. The Turok games have seen a few changes when released in different regions. Both Turok and Turok 2 were given different titles in Japan. Turok Dinosaur Hunter became Dimensional Warrior Turok, and Turok 2 Seeds of Evil became Violence Killer Turok New Generation. Meanwhile, the German version of Turok was censored in several ways. All the human enemies in the game were replaced with robots, and their sound effects were altered. The blood was also removed from the game's box art. Turok Rage Wars also had regional censorship. Oddly, 4 playable characters were changed in the German game. Adon, Campaigner, Bastille, and Syra were all altered. Adon was entirely replaced by a robot, which even overwrote her alternate skins, which became unchanging robots. Syra was also replaced with, you guessed it, a robot. Campaigner was altered to appear less human with a metal tone to his skin and red eyes, and Bastille was given a helmet with an opaque visor to cover his face. The original North American version of Turok Rage Wars featured a glitch that effectively rendered the game unbeatable. One of the modes in the game's 2-player co-op trials was Frag Tag. In this mode, one player's character is turned into an animal, forcing them to reach a special platform to change back while the opposing team can earn points for killing the animal player. At the end of the match, the team with the highest score wins. Due to the glitch, however, any frag tag level played in co-op would result in a failure for the players, regardless of how many points they'd earned. This made the 2-player trials mode impossible to complete. The bug was fixed in later North American builds, and this glitch never affected other regions. For North American players stuck with a defective copy, Acclaim offered to send a replacement cartridge. This offer wasn't advertised in any way, however. Players could only take advantage of it by emailing Acclaim, where they'd be instructed to mail their copy in to receive a replacement. The game was originally released on black N64 cartridges, but the replacement cartridges were the simple gray. Because of how relatively unknown the replacement offer was, gray cartridges of Turok Rage Wars have gone on to become valuable collector's items. Another rare and extremely unique piece of Turok history was sold online. In January of 2017, YouTube channel Silicon Classics uploaded a video about a collection of CGI indie workstations they acquired that once belonged to Acclaim before their bankruptcy. While documenting the contents of the computers, one of them was found to contain the complete source code for Turok Dinosaur Hunter. Rather than dumping the code online, which would have led to legal ramifications, Silicon Classics put the computer up for sale on eBay. About a year later, a Reddit user going by the name of Code Ouroboros made a post claiming to have found the source code on a file sharing site. But there was a catch. Whoever uploaded it had also encrypted the code with a series of passwords and provided a set of riddles as clues. According to updates on the Reddit post, the first two passwords were Pandora's Box and Trojan Horse, but the third and final riddle seemed to stump them, with no further updates from Code Ouroboros. However, in August 2018, the game's source code surfaced online, allowing anyone to access the complete library of character models, sound effects, music, and other assets from Turok. The Turok franchise continued to evolve after the N64's lifecycle. The first next-gen Turok game was Turok Evolution, which Acclaim advertised aggressively. The company announced they were offering $10,000 in US savings bonds to any parents who named their newborn child after the titular hero in the game. The child had to be named Turok for at least a year, had to be born around August or early September 2002, and an official birth certificate had to be presented to Acclaim as proof. This stunt followed a previous campaign where Acclaim offered £500, roughly $766 at the time, and an Xbox to any Brits who'd legally changed their name to Turok. The British marketing stunt had thousands of responses, and we can only pray that the Name Your Child Turok stunt had none.
The Super Nintendo, home of some of the best, or rather most super, RPGs, platformers, and adventure games ever made. It took us from 8 bits to 16, and it axed bleeps and bloops so that we could hear sweet, bit-crushed samples of actual instruments. Titles such as Earthbound, Super Mario All-Stars, and even games like The Lion King all gave us something memorable to see, hear, and play. And we'll be covering all these games and more in this video. But what truly made the SNES stand out against the competition back in the day was highly polished and super fun titles, like, I don't know, Kirby Superstar, for example. Kirby Superstar, despite being intended for an SNES release from the get-go, actually began development on the original NES. This unreleased NES prototype was used for internal purposes only, as a way of finalizing all of the ideas that would go into the end product before the team had an actual SNES development kit. This process can be seen with the NES sprites for the yo-yo and cutter abilities, which were released to the public over 20 years later in an issue of Famitsu. The sprites shown look nearly identical to their counterparts in the finished product, with the main exception being the lack of Superstar's signature ability hats. Director Masahiro Sakurai stated that this type of development style is beneficial to him, as the starting step of finalizing all of a game's ideas via an internal prototype makes the rest of development significantly easier, with many of the original ideas having already been partially fleshed out before development of the final product begins to take shape. Speaking of early design stages of a game, The Lion King actually includes a number of levels and characters that don't have any obvious connection to its source material, The Lion King movie. This is because several levels and characters that appear throughout the game come from deleted scenes of The Lion King. During the film's production, the original intention for the transition from young Simba to adult Simba was considerably longer and featured a number of the events that occur within the game. Because the game was being produced alongside the film, these levels were being created during the point when it was decided to have these scenes removed from the film. It was decided to keep these levels and characters in the game, even though they never appear in the film's theatrical release. This means that the game actually includes a more complete series of events than the film, arguably making it a more comprehensive look at the film's planned story. While the SNES had many great platformers, we shouldn't forget its more experimental titles, such as the much-beloved Mario Paint. The game was more of an art tool than a game, but even the game's original release wasn't the most experimental version. The title actually had an updated release distributed exclusively through the Japan-exclusive Satellaview service. This new release introduces support for standard controllers alongside the original's usage of the Super NES mouse. Something that, as a kid, would have been a huge benefit considering many people bought the game second-hand without a mouse, myself included, rendering it impossible to play. But this Yushao Naizoban version of the game introduces an additional picture for the player to color in, titled Dreaming of the Moon, created by Mizota Hiroko of Tokyo, the winner of a contest associated with Mario Paint BS Ban. But the game had some secrets that everyone could enjoy. The original release of Mario Paint held a secret message that was rarely seen by painters. When creating any image or animation, if the images are sufficiently large enough and highly detailed, it's possible that the game will be unable to implement compression on them, pushing them beyond the cartridge's 32 kilobytes of SRAM. If this happens, when the player attempts to save their creation, the save robot will display the rare error message of data overflow, including a unique animation that cannot be seen otherwise, which has the robot puff out smoke from its quote-unquote ears with a looping explosion sound effect. Speaking of alterations made for specific markets, the classic RPG Breath of Fire was actually changed for its localization in the West. The most notable change is that the original Japanese release of the game included a stereotypical and racist depiction of a black person. Khan, known as Dank in the Japanese version, had his race altered for overseas markets. Originally, Khan had a tan but desaturated ashy complexion, with a set of full lips and curly hair. This was changed in the West to make him Arabian-esque, with smaller lips and straight hair instead. Why this was changed was pretty much a no-brainer, but this isn't the only 16-bit Breath of Fire title to be censored. Breath of Fire 2 was also censored, though this was done long after the game's first release on the SNES. For the game's digital release on the Wii U Virtual Console, 2 instances of text changes were made. The first being a very simple change of the word damn being changed into darn, while the second change is a bit more involved. One of the game's mini-games was changed, specifically in how it is described. Originally, the translation described the game as being kind of like Othello, with the issue being that Othello is actually a registered trademark and one which had encountered some legal disputes in the years running up to Breath of Fire 2's Virtual Console release. It was likely the easiest option to simply remove this text entirely, which is exactly what happens. The line, "It's kind of like Othello," was simply removed entirely. Another popular JRPG for the Super Nintendo was the last 16-bit Final Fantasy VI. In the game, when the party encounters Cyan, it's possible to find the Book of Secrets, an item located at Mount Zozo in the World of Ruin. Along with guides for understanding and operating machinery, the player finds the book in Cyan's trunk. The English release of the game sheds no light on the nature of its contents, but the original Japanese version gives a small clue as to what's inside the pages. Here, it's referred to as Choto Echi no Hon, which means a little naughty book. In the later Game Boy Advance release of the game, the book was called Bushido in the Bedroom, with the more obvious implication that the book was of a sexual nature. Okay, so look, we know it's a bit of a meme at this point that the original version of Super Mario Bros. 2, which we in the West saw on the NES, was actually a reskin of a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic. We know it's a meme, but we gotta explain it every time, because it's a very basic piece of information that needs to have context as to what we're talking about, so I'm sorry. What isn't as well known is that the original Super Mario 2 from Japan, which plays more like the original Super Mario Bros. And went on to be known as The Lost Levels in America and Europe, almost saw a standalone release in the West via Nintendo Power magazine. In an interview with writer John Irwin for his 2014 book on the game, former marketing manager at Nintendo of America and founding editor of Nintendo Power, Gail Tilden, stated, "We weren't doing anything with it, so I worked up with my Nintendo Power agency a campaign called The Lost Levels." According to Tilden, a single NES cartridge containing the original Super Mario Bros. 2 was made, but Nintendo worried the title would confuse the market, and thus they scrapped the idea. The Lost Levels rebranding would eventually make its way to the SNES title Super Mario All-Stars, alongside Super Mario Bros. 1, 3, and the Western reskinned version of 2. As of this video, the current whereabouts of the NES prototype are not known, but it could be a great find someday. Keep your eyes out, perhaps. Earthbound may also have been a sequel to a Japanese exclusive NES title, Mother, but instead of playing it safe, this sequel went far more in depth. During the game's opening, the player must investigate a meteorite that has struck the Earth just a short walk from their house. Along with their friend Porky, the player comes face to face with the falling star, but this scene actually has a unique aspect to it, unlike any other in the game. At least as far as we know. Despite Earthbound being a single-player adventure, by plugging in a second controller during this scene, it's possible to control the light that shines from the meteorite. This wasn't discovered for at least a good 20 years after the game's release. But there is actually more interesting information that comes from the first hour of the game. After encountering the celestial rock, the player is joined by the stout Buzz, though his time in the player's journey doesn't last long, as when returning Porky home to his mum, he is immediately dispatched and taken out. Usually, this scene will have Ness take the Soundstone from Buzz, but there is an opportunity to change this by having a full inventory. If the player has no space on their person to take the Soundstone from Buzz, he will notice this and not give it to you. Instead, he will transport it to Tracy, meaning that you don't have to hold the Soundstone in your inventory for the entire game, and it will still record the melodies of the Your Sanctuary locations even in Tracy's possession. Normally, the Soundstone remains in your inventory for the whole game and cannot be sent to Escargo Express. If you do wish to have the Soundstone back from Tracy, you must talk to her in person, though there's of course a benefit in leaving it in storage, as it opens an additional inventory slot that would otherwise be occupied permanently. Would you also like to know the entire history of Nintendo's consoles, all the way from the NES, SNES, N64, and GameCube to the Switch? For a whole hour of Nintendo console trivia, click or tap the video on screen. Now, as much as I love the SNES, I also love modern video games, so I'm going to go and spend several hours dying repeatedly on the first boss of Elden Ring. Have a good one, folks, and I will see you some other time. Peace.
Did you know? Yoshi's Island almost didn't have its colorful hand-drawn art style. While he was working on Super Mario World, Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto decided Yoshi should be the star of his own game. Past Yoshi titles failed to impress Miyamoto, so he decided to make his own Yoshi game instead. His initial demo used graphics similar to previous Mario games, but were then rejected by the marketing team at Nintendo. They told Miyamoto to try pre-rendered graphics like Donkey Kong Country, as Country had received acclaim for its visuals. Rather than following the marketing team's suggestions, Miyamoto instead redesigned the game to be even more cartoonish. And this redesign was approved, leading to the art style we see today. While the English version of Yoshi's Island is called Super Mario World 2, the original Japanese title is simply Super Mario Yoshi's Island. The name was changed in the West to capitalize on the success of Super Mario World. Yoshis could also eat the dolphins in the Japanese version of Super Mario World, but not in the international versions. This was presumably due to cultural differences. However, this was not true for the Game Boy Advance remake, as Yoshi could eat the dolphins in all versions of the game. In the German release of Yoshi's Island, the level Touch Fuzzy, Get Dizzy was called Lustiges Bauerndrama, which abbreviates to LSD, possibly as a nod to the hallucinogenic effects of the fuzzies in the level. The extra level in World 6 has a segment where the player rides a series of moving platforms that spell out Yoshi's name. In the original Japanese version, though, it's written as Yasi. Bert the Bashful, the mid-boss of World 1, resembles a character named Obelix from the French comic series Asterix. Fittingly, Bert's name in the French version of Yoshi's Island is Gros Belixo, with Gros meaning fat and Belixo being an anagram of Obelix. In another international reference, the boss of World 3, Naval Piranha, is called Audrey in the German version of the game, alluding to the creature from the Little Shop of Horrors. Naval Piranha actually has another unique secret. When the player approaches the room, Naval Piranha can be seen in its unenlarged state. If timed right, the player can throw an egg and defeat it in one hit, surprising Kamek and allowing the player to bypass the entire fight. There's even a reference to this in Yoshi's Woolly World. Sneaking up on and hitting Naval Piranha with a yarn ball will trigger a similar cutscene, but the battle continues once it's over. And in World 4-1 of Yoshi's Island, there's a rock formation that resembles a topless woman. There's an easy-to-miss Easter egg in the Jungle Hut level of Yoshi's Story. Hitting the spiders with an egg in the uppermost hut affects the music that plays in the background. Each of the 6 spiders is essentially a trigger that changes which instruments are played. There's also a musical secret in the trial mode. If the level select screen is left to loop 8 times, the elusive Totaka's song will play. Totaka's Song is a 19-note melody by Nintendo sound designer Kazumi Totaka, and it's often hidden in Totaka's games. Yoshi's Story was the first game to give Yoshi an actual voice, which was provided by Kazumi Totaka himself. Totaka's voice clips were reused for all Yoshi appearances in later Yoshi games, Mario games, and Super Smash Bros. It wasn't until Super Mario Galaxy 2 that new voice clips were recorded, with Totaka reprising his role over a decade after the release of Yoshi's Story. The Yoshi series has a fair amount of unused content. In Yoshi's Island, there are 3 scrap transformations for Yoshi: an airplane, a mushroom, and a tree. There are several unused enemies, including a larger version of the Ukiki designed to resemble Donkey Kong. A red cannon that fires heat-seeking bullet bills also appears. And while never used in the original Yoshi's Island despite being fully functional, the red cannons did appear in the Game Boy Advance remake in World 6's secret level. There was a specifically made demo based on Yoshi's Story that went unused. It was made to show off the graphical features of the Game Boy Advance when the system was unveiled, and the gameplay was changed from the N64 game as Yoshi could not throw eggs or use his tongue. In many Mario spin-off games, Yoshi is paired up with Birdo, sometimes as a couple. Birdo has a long history of controversy surrounding her gender, but Yoshi's gender is a subject of confusion as well. When the topic came up during an Iwata Asks interview, Shigeru Miyamoto said, "Sometimes people ask whether Yoshi is a boy or a girl. If I answer probably a boy, then they say, so a boy is laying eggs? But the moment I say Yoshi lays eggs, so Yoshi must be a girl, they'll say, then Yoshi's voice needs to sound more like a girl's. But I want to make video games without having to worry about such background info." One curious part of Yoshi's anatomy is the saddle on his back. According to longtime Mario series designer Takashi Tezuka, Yoshi was originally supposed to be a type of Koopa. That saddle you see on his back was actually his shell. And for anyone who's wondered what Yoshi looks like without his shoes, he apparently has padded feet.
Intended to tide over audiences awaiting a true original 3D Sonic adventure on the Sega Saturn, Sonic R ultimately ended up as one of the closest things fans would ever come to one. Desperate to fill a gap in their 1997 holiday lineup, Sega handed their mascot over to Traveler's Tales. The result was an unconventional on-foot racer with an upbeat Europop soundtrack. But how did such a departure from the traditional installments of Sega's biggest platforming series come to be? Chasing up former staff and scanning through the wealth of information carefully archived by sites like Sonic Retro, I've been piecing together the story behind Sonic R. Join me as I go back in time to another world when Sega was still trying to change the Saturn's fortunes. The original concept of a Sonic racing game is known to have come from Yuji Naka, one of the major creative forces behind Sonic, who served as lead programmer on each of the early main series titles. Naka had always been interested in doing an on-foot racing game with Sonic characters. The competitive mode in Sonic 2, which offered split-screen racing for 2 players, was one early exploration of this idea. After that, he still intended to one day make a separate spin-off game around it, and when the Saturn's lineup was in need of support, the ideal opportunity for it presented itself. Naka's original intention was to have Sonic Team themselves develop it. However, they had since become otherwise engaged, creating a Saturn collection of Sonic's Mega Drive outings called Sonic Jam. Sega instead turned to a small developer in Knutsford, England. Traveller's Tales had first caught Sega's attention with their Mega Drive version of the Toy Story tie-in video game. Impressed with this effort, Yuji Naka had personally recommended them for a potential collaboration. The result was Sonic 3D Blast for the Mega Drive and Saturn, a platformer that offered a different take on the Hedgehog with an isometric camera perspective. Sega was sufficiently pleased with their work on this title that they were already considering them for another future Sonic project before the end of its development. When Sega eventually chose Traveller's Tales for their Sonic racing game, however, they were already underway on another project for them. I spoke to John Burton, Sonic R's lead programmer and the founder of Traveller's Tales, who recounted what happened. The developers at TT had been creating their own engine, designed specifically to be used for racing games on the Saturn. They had struck a deal to develop a Formula 1 game exclusively for the Saturn, which was set to be published by Sega themselves. This was intended to compete with the 1996 PS1 Formula 1 game by Bizarre Creations, which had been a booming financial success. The TT Formula 1 project was a few months into pre-production when in early 1997, Sega decided to apply the brakes on it. The long-awaited Sonic X-treme, once supposed to be Sega's flagship 3D Sonic platformer for the Saturn, had been cancelled. It left Sega scrambling to fill a blue hedgehog-shaped hole in their holiday lineup. Taking Yuji Naka's suggestion, they signed a new contract with Traveller's Tales, permitting them to retrofit their Formula 1 project into a Sonic racer. Development began in around February 1997, during which time it was known as Sonic TT. References to this title can be found in the game's source code. John Burton told me that this was a nod not only to Traveller's Tales, but to racing terms like Time Trial and Taurus Trophy. Sega initially signaled that they liked the idea, but later chose to change it after a couple of months to Sonic R. According to an interview conducted in early 1997 with a Sega spokesperson, quote, "The R stands for many different things and not just racing. It is up to the player to decide exactly what." Due to Sega being based in Japan, the game was subject to a transcontinental development. Characters and levels were sketched out by Japanese staff and sent over to Traveller's Tales in England for them to model and program. In the case of the racetracks, they were quite literally sketched out on paper. Sega's artists sent Traveller's Tales actual paper drawings of the map layouts for them to adapt. Sega's primary liaison with Traveller's Tales was a producer named Kat Sato, who spent development on site in England. Since internet infrastructure in the UK was in its infancy, Sato spent a significant amount of time in expensive long-distance phone calls to Japan, discussing the game's design in order to accurately relay their instructions. According to Sato, he formed a good relationship with the team at Traveller's Tales and became close personal friends with John Burton, to the point at which he attended his wedding during the development of Sonic R. Yuji Naka also paid the studio a visit, John Burton told me. Yuji Naka did visit the studio in person. In fact, we had dinner with him at a local Italian restaurant. I remember the restaurant had paper tablecloths at the time, and it was for people to doodle on during dinner. Yuji drew a Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon on the tablecloth, and I remember afterwards wishing I'd taken it with us instead of leaving it there. I also met him again in Japan. We had a meeting and dinner, I think. I remember he parked his Sonic Blue Porsche 911 in one of those vending machine car parks they have in Japan. I'd never seen parking like that before. By March 14th, 1997, the developers had put together an early first prototype for the game, which John Burton later labelled 0.1. Retrofitting some of the work done on their Formula 1 game, this essentially acted as a first run at demonstrating the technology that would power Sonic R. The user could guide the camera on a fixed track through a metallic blue racecourse, complete with Sonic and Robotnik Easter eggs in the background, and in true Sonic fashion, a loop-de-loop. The environment seen in 0.1 was made for internal purposes, and never appeared in later builds. 3 weeks later, however, the team was starting to realise the first level that would make it into the release game. Shared by John Burton in 2017 on YouTube, version 0.2 features a very early resort island. Like the previous prototype, it can only be controlled by maneuvering down a predetermined line, but it offers us a glimpse into what was and what had yet to be at this early phase. Multiple Sonic models glide down the track, an early test of multiple characters before other character models had been built in. The level featured a clearly very different skybox. This was actually a placeholder used for test purposes, which originated from another Traveler's Tales game, 1994's Mickey Mania. It was taken from the background of the Moose Hunters level, based on the classic Disney short of the same name. Another noteworthy fixture of this build is a metallic Sonic model floating throughout the course. This was implemented to test reflection mapping on characters during gameplay, but the Saturn, with its limited capabilities, was unable to support it, according to John Burton. The effect was instead reserved for other parts of the game, such as the rotating R on the title screen and the reflective Sonic head seen during loading. Sonic R's art, by all accounts, evolved considerably over the course of its creation, and was initially intended to feature a style much closer to Sonic 3D Blast. Resort Island, for example, once included foliage textures that were identical to those seen in 3D Blast, but this direction was later abandoned. The following prototype, 0.3 from May 2nd in 1997, marks the first demo to be shown to Sega. By this point, the player had more direct control over Sonic. We can start to see the beginning of the game's innovative fading technology to mask its draw distance, and the rings now had collision programmed, meaning they could be collected. The ring gates, on the other hand, which players can unlock by collecting a certain amount of rings, had yet to be put in place. Sonic could instead freely walk through the cave, where one would later be added. This build shows us another unused skybox as well, one including a sun setting over a mountain range. As it turns out, this background was intended to be used in the game until fairly late on. Sonic R was previewed by a myriad of different publications in the run-up to launch, and this evening variant of Resort Island was included in many of them. It appears to have been present in the game until sometime in summer of 1997. John Burton has explained the very simple rationale behind its removal. Upon listening to Can You Feel the Sunshine, the track's musical theme, it dawned upon John how out of place the background felt in consideration of its lyrics. It was therefore altered to be set during the middle of the day, so players could truly feel the aforementioned sunshine. The game made its official public debut at E3 in June 1997. A trailer circulated at the time claimed it was 20% completed. Builds with an early version of Resort Island were playable on the show floor to attendees, and the developers took this opportunity to closely observe the reactions of players. One valuable piece of feedback gathered from this experience relates to the water which flows throughout the level. John Burton said that in these prototypes, falling into the lake would slow the player down significantly, making it hard for them to recover in the competition. People sampling the demo would often abandon their play sessions entirely when this happened, quickly losing interest and walking away from the kiosks. When the team returned from E3 that year, John therefore made it a priority to speed up movement when underwater, making it less daunting and easier for players to regain their footing in the race. As others tell it, however, Sonic R garnered some very negative reactions at E3, causing considerable concern at Sega. Hirokazu Yasuhara, who is best known for being the lead designer on the original 2D Sonic games, spoke candidly about this in a 2003 interview with Game Informer. He revealed that he was drafted in mid-development to revamp its level design. Sega asked me to work with Traveler's Tales. Sonic R had received awful reviews at E3, and Sega wanted me to improve it. I was asked to help out, even though I was not working on Sonic games anymore. Sonic R was promoted by Sega as part of a multi-game marketing strategy called Project Sonic. The goal of this label was to advertise Sonic's Saturn titles and to boost the franchise's profile in Japan. Phase 1 of Project Sonic was Sonic Jam, while Sonic R became Phase 2. By all accounts, it was shown to journalists not only at E3 but behind closed doors numerous times in the months after. It's in these previews that we can see more cuts and changes made on the road to release. The character icons seen on the left of the HUD featured different art, similar in appearance to the item boxes from 2D Sonic games. They were later redone and given new black backgrounds. The The ring gates in Resort Island originally required a far higher amount of rings to pass through. One, for instance, needed as many as 100 rings, whereas the same gate in the Finish game asks for half that amount. The mini-map seen in the bottom right of the screen in the Finish game is noticeably missing from these prototypes, although one was always intended to be added later, it simply had yet to be implemented. Sonic R was prominently featured in the UK's Sega Saturn magazine, and it was in the August 1997 issue that they showed off a power-up which was ultimately destined for the cutting room floor. The game was originally intended to include the 3 element shields introduced in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the Bubble Shield, the Lightning Shield, and the Flame Shield, and it was the last of those which was subject to removal. Like its appearance in Sonic 3, the Flame Shield essentially functioned as a buffer against attacks and would be extinguished if the player fell underwater. The item was removed from the game a few months out from release, as the developers deemed it too similar to the Lightning Shield, which too protected against attacks and disappeared after coming into contact with water, but also had the benefit of attracting nearby rings. The Flame Shields that were built into the game appear to have been replaced by Lightning Shields, if a leaked prototype from September 97 is any indication, as the Lightning Shields in this version share the same colour graphic as the Flame Shield, but do attract rings. One noticeable difference between earlier prototypes and later builds is the appearance of Dr. Robotnik's Eggmobile ship. Its undercarriage once sported a large black and red missile with a mischievous grinning face. It was eventually altered to a grey cannon due to impracticalities presented by the original design. The developers would have had to animate the missile detaching from the underside of Robotnik's vehicle and a new one appearing in its place, something John Burton said their engine was not set up to support on the Sega Saturn. That's why in prototypes with the older design, Robotnik's missile cannot actually fire. The final design, which was much simpler, also had the benefit of trimming the model's polygon count. Another significant change to weaponry in the game concerns Amy's car. Originally, it was going to be able to produce a large spinning saw blade to attack racers in front of her. This was seen as a way to put her on par with Robotnik, who was planned to have an offensive maneuver of his own, but it was ultimately vetoed for being too violent. Across the board, the initial prototype models for Sonic R were more detailed than those in the finished product. Many of them received numerous minor adjustments, usually to keep them in line with polygon quotas for the sake of performance. Tails once had 3D whiskers and strands of hair that stuck out. Amy's car included a spoiler on the rear. Knuckles had more defined dreadlocks using more polygons which hung down his back more, and an alternate colour scheme for his shoes featuring orange, which was closer to his appearance in Sonic 3 and Knuckles. These older renders were used in select promotional material in the run-up to release, and even appeared in the game's instruction manual. Metal Sonic, on the other hand, once had a more detailed jet engine on his back, and the Egg Robo 2 sported a jetpack that was originally split into 2 separate parts, but was later merged into one. Throughout 1997, Sonic R appeared on multiple occasions in Sega Video Magazine, a series of promotional VHS tapes sent out to advertise new and upcoming Sega products in Japan. The footage used in these tapes includes unfinished versions of Tails and Knuckles, distinguishable by the blue aura around them when jumping. This indicates that they must have been newly added to the game, as the developers had yet to alter the aura from Sonic's blue to their respective orange and red colours. These clips are also notable for featuring an alternate version of the game's main musical theme, Super Sonic Racing. While the final song was performed by TJ Davis, this iteration, which had different instrumentation, was sung by another artist.
Sonic R は5800円で12月4日発売予定です。
This version of the song also appeared at E397 and could be heard during gameplay on the Resort Island stage. To learn more about this mysterious track, I spoke to the composer of Sonic R's soundtrack, Richard Jacks, who explained its origins in full. Quote, "This was a work-in-progress version of Super Sonic Racing. The singer is a lady who used to work in the Sega Europe offices, and I used her to create a demo of the song for Yuji Naka to listen to and approve. This is often what takes place before spending financial resources on studio time with session singers/musicians. Richard added that he did not have a copy of it himself. In the beginning, it was not Yuji Naka's intention for each level's music to include vocals. According to Richard Jacks and TJ Davis, they were initially only contracted to produce Supersonic Racing as a title theme, but the song was received so warmly by Naka that he decided the rest of the soundtrack should follow suit. John Burton has said that he was concerned about how audiences would respond to this direction at first, and therefore decided to build in an option to turn the vocals off. He even planned at one point that they would be disabled by default, and instrumental versions would play instead. Over time, however, he grew to like the vocal tracks, so much so that he decided they would be turned on by default in the final game. As 1997 went on, Traveller's Tales continued interacting with the press, providing up-to-date information as the project raced towards the finish line. Tips and Tricks magazine was one such outlet to cover the game, and in September 97, they reported on 2 different gameplay modes that ultimately didn't make it into the release game. Quote, "A variety of gameplay modes are available: Ring Attack, Relay Race, and even Tag. The only one of those to actually be realized in the end was Tag, wherein the player must bump into different computer-controlled races to win. Whereas the elusive Ring Attack was never again mentioned in future previews, Relay Race continued to be teased." In the October 97 edition of Sega Saturn magazine, John Burton mentions some of the planned game types, and his choice of words reveals how unsure he was of Relay Race's inclusion at the time. Quote, "There will be a 2-player mode, including race and battle modes hopefully, as well as time trial, tag, and possibly relay modes." This was one of the last times the relay mode was mentioned, and for many years, over 2 decades in fact, what this would have entailed remained uncertain. That was until June 2018 when John Burton revealed via YouTube that it would have seen the player choosing a few different characters and taking turns controlling each throughout the race. As the player finished one lap, they would pass over to the next character and so on until the race concluded. John wasn't completely sure of why it was dropped, but speculated the game's tech simply wasn't set up to do character swapping of this nature. Time constraints may have also played a role, given how the developers had a strict deadline for Sonic R to be on sale in time for the 1997 holiday period. This may also explain the absence of another mode teased in magazines at the time, called Mirror Mode. Like the mode of the same name from the Mario Kart series, this would have reflected each track, challenging the player's knowledge of each course with this added twist. A mirror mode appearing in Sonic R was mentioned in a couple of different previews, including the aforementioned Sega Saturn magazine write-up from October 97. John Burton believes that it was never finished primarily because its implementation would have slowed down the game's polygon draw code. Its removal is just another reminder of the delicate balance Traveller's Tales had to strike as they attempted to work within the Saturn's hardware limitations. In the final months before launch, a mock-up of the game's cover was sent out to media outlets and toy catalogs featuring different art from that which later showed up on store shelves. A version of this art also functioned as the title screen in prototypes. The original render seen here was drawn in a 2D style more in line with other Sonic covers from this era, but was eventually redesigned. What replaced it was a completely different take on the material with 3D visuals. John Burton has said that he much prefers the original rendition, and that Sega had it redone to avoid spoiling the presence of Metal Sonic, a secret unlockable character who could be seen on the older cover. The original box art does briefly appear in the final game, however, at the end of the credits, with the phrase "See ya" placed over it. The high-resolution 3D models of characters and levels took multiple days to render, according to Burton. The Silicon Graphics computers which produced them cost $30,000 each, using software packages worth $20,000 back in 1997. Some minor differences can be observed between the final courses and these renders, such as in the case of Regal Ruin. In the finished version, pillars were later added into the pool of water to the right of the start line, for example. Through examining earlier builds and previews, we can see that each level in the game had a single word working title during development. Resort Island was Island, Radical City was City, Regal Ruin was Ruin, and according to the November 97 edition of Saturn Power magazine, Reactive Factory was originally referred to as Industrial, before being changed to Factory. Each was later given a title starting with the letter R to match the game's namesake. We can mine further changes from a prototype shared by Hidden Palace dated September 1997, which contains 3 different levels: Island, City, and Factory, the last of which is still very unfinished. The differences between it and the release build are manifold. The prototype has different menus which are static and include the older high poly renders of the characters, different loading screens featuring a disc with a reflection of the original title screen art. The race countdown timer sound is different, and its text reads 3, 2, 1, go, which was later changed to Ready, Set, Go, with a line voiced by TJ Davis.
Ready, set, go!
The countdown text is partially transparent in the prototype and a darker shade of blue. Sonic uses his idle animation on the start line, whereas in the final game he stands still. All AI characters receive a speed boost at the start of each race in the prototype, meaning the player always starts in last place and must catch them up. Each course was intended at this point to contain 9 separate coins to collect, as opposed to the 5 in the finish game. Some are hidden in places where coins aren't present in the final version. In Resort Island, for instance, one is next to the huts, another can be found among the pine trees. The ring gates, which grant access to alternate routes, required a high amount of rings in the prototype. The Chaos Emeralds were originally a different, taller shape with a point at the top. Sonic's idle animation was different. The icons on the left of the screen, as well as sporting different designs, work slightly differently. In this version, the character in first place has a larger icon, while in the final build, the player's icon is always bigger than the others to highlight your position more effectively. If Sonic finishes a race in either 4th or 5th place, he will sometimes burst into tears in the prototype, but this was later removed. Radical City's start line is further forward, closer to the archway, and the characters begin much closer to each other. Likewise, the start position for Reactive Factory was further down the course, closer to these two slopes. The level also has a metal floor surrounding it in the distance, which was replaced with water in the final version. The first alternate route you encounter in this course has a slightly different design here. The entrance to the spring room was situated at the front of the metal spire, whereas in the release build it's found around the back of it and takes slightly longer to access. It's also surrounded by water in the prototype that the player can fall into, whereas this water is blocked off by fencing in the final. When AI characters complete the race before you in the prototype, they will wait for you on the finish line. In the final build, they will instead continue doing laps of the track until the race is over. Then there are elements of the prototype that are simply unfinished. The minimap, for instance, doesn't yet track the positions of characters throughout the stages. The arrows instructing players where to go haven't yet been implemented. Robotnik's hands are missing from his victory pose. The replay feature is broken and often sends your character bumping into walls and falling into water. Some of the alternate routes in the factory level are incomplete. Doors where coins are hidden in the final game cannot be opened, and the path to the Chaos Emerald aboard the submarine is partly obscured. On the other hand, it's notable how much of the game was nailed down by this point. Even small elements like Easter eggs are in place, such as one planted there by John Burton personally. He included an ichthus, a symbol which is said to have been employed by Christians to discreetly identify other members of the church amid the persecution of the Roman Empire. The symbol was often placed on doors of homes and churches. In Sonic R, it can be found on one of the huts in Resort Island, a nod to Burton's religious beliefs. According to John, Sega was fully aware of the symbol's presence in the game and did not object to it. Despite having around only 9 months, Traveller's Tales was able to meet their tight deadline and finish the game in time for the 1997 holidays. Hirokazu Yasuhara, who was initially unsure of the project's potential when he joined the team, later expressed a degree of appreciation for it. Quote, "I think that, although I only joined the project in the middle, the final version of Sonic R is actually quite good. I understand that it is difficult to reverse negative impressions on the game after it receives bad reviews at E3. People do not play or buy it, so they cannot change their opinions. However, I do admit that the base concept of Sonic R, in which the player drives running characters, is not great." Sonic R was first released in November 1997, but that might not have been the case were it not for the actions of one person in particular. Kat Sato, who was overseeing the project on Sega's behalf at Traveller's Tales, revealed in an interview with French blog Terre de Jeu that he got into a heated disagreement with Yuji Naka over the game's content. Naka had requested more additions to the game, but with the schedule already tight, Sato told him that it could not be done, leading to an intense argument. So impassioned was this dispute that Sato, who had previously been a prominent public figurehead for the game, no longer even wanted his name associated with it. He chose to have his name excluded from the in-game credits. I asked John Burton to give his side of what happened. Quote, "I know Katz had his credit removed from the game, which is a real shame, as he was a great supporter of the studio. I've no idea if he lost his credit because he was protecting us from some of the changes, or if he was perhaps standing up for some of the design decisions we made. Either way, I'm pretty sure it was for supporting us." This was eventually corrected when Sonic R was ported to PC 1 year later. In that release, Sato was credited as the project director, and in the years since has publicly discussed his work on it. Still, it's worth remarking on the fact that if you played the original version of Sonic R, the project director, one of the people most responsible for shaping it into what it is today, is not credited for it at all. Sonic R received mixed to positive reviews upon launch. Critics praised its level design and visuals, while opinion was divided over its soundtrack and short length. Despite this division, the game has remained beloved by a passionate sect of the Sonic fanbase. 20 years on from release, John Burton began sharing fresh insights from its development, showcasing prototypes and material he had been able to preserve. His YouTube channel Game Hut has offered fans a rare look behind the curtain of Traveller's Tales and into the creation of some of its past titles.